My name is Chloe Moore. When I was 19 years old, I sat across from a leasing agent in Baton Rouge, handed over my driver's license, and waited for the keys to my first apartment. Instead, she pushed my paperwork back across her desk, refused to meet my eyes, and told me my application was denied. My credit score was 412. According to her monitor, I had defaulted on 4 commercial accounts and a heavy machinery lease. Total outstanding debt, $142,650. I was a college sophomore, working 2 campus jobs. I did not own heavy machinery, but the people who raised me did. Before we get into how my own parents mortgaged my identity to keep their business afloat, and the moment a bank officer handed me the power to decide their fate, welcome back to A Lane of Vengeance. If you have ever had your trust broken by the people whose last name you share, drop a comment. Tell me your age and where you are listening from. You are not alone in this. Make sure you subscribe. The leasing agent tapped her polished fingernail against the printout. The sound was sharp in the quiet office. I looked down at the paper. There was my name, my social security number, and a list of defaults dating back to the week of my 18th birthday. A custodial business trust. That was the legal term, printed in small black ink. My father, Richard, ran a generational construction supply business 3 hours north in Shreveport. My mother, Susan, managed the books. This sold lumber, industrial equipment, and apparently illusions. When I was 14, my father asked me to sign a piece of paper on our kitchen counter. He told me it was a college savings account. He held the pen out, offering his easy salesman smile. I took the pen. I signed. The trust lay dormant in the banking system until the exact second I became a legal adult. Then it activated, turning me into a human shield for his failing ledger. My phone buzzed in my pocket while I was still staring at the leasing agent. An unknown number. I answered it. A flat voice on the other end read a script about wage garnishment regarding a commercial tractor. I ended the call. I stood up, thanked the agent, and walked out into the stifling Louisiana heat. I walked across campus to the student parking lot. My older sister, Ashley, drove a brand new SUV, purchased in cash by my father as a college graduation gift. I drove a 10-year-old sedan with a cracked windshield. In our house, Ashley was the delicate one, the one who needed protection and pristine conditions. I was the resilient one, the backup plan, the one who could just figure things out. I got into my car. The steering wheel burned against my palms. I had stopped at the campus library to print the full credit report. It sat on the passenger seat, 12 pages long, folded into thirds. I did not cry. Crying was a luxury for people who had a safety net. I turned the key in the ignition. Shreveport was a 3-hour drive. I had 180 minutes to figure out what I was going to say to the man who stole my future before it even started. 3 hours on Interstate 49 gives a person a lot of time to process a betrayal. I did not turn on the radio. I kept both hands on the steering wheel and watched the mile markers tick past. By the time I pulled into the gravel lot of Moore Construction Supply in Shreveport, the Louisiana sun was sitting low and heavy in the sky. The yard looked the same as it always had: stacks of treated lumber wrapped in plastic, pallets of cinder blocks, 2 yellow forklifts parked near the loading dock. It looked like a successful enterprise. It looked like stability. I parked my 10-year-old sedan next to my father's pristine pickup truck. I turned off the engine and picked up the folded credit report from the passenger seat. The paper felt thick in my hand. 12 pages of financial ruin. The bell above the glass door chimed when I walked into the main office. The air conditioning was running high, mixing the smell of stale coffee with sawdust and industrial floor cleaner. My father, Richard, stood behind the laminated counter. He did not look up immediately. He was focused on a heavy, dark green book resting on the counter. It had thick brass corners and a ribbed spine. I knew that book. Growing up, it was the only item in the store we were never allowed to touch. He called it the real ledger. It was where the off-the-books accounting lived. The cash transactions, the true margins of a business that was bleeding out behind a facade of success. He made a final notation with a silver pen, closed the brass ledger, and looked up. He smiled, the same easy, calculated smile he used on local contractors and bank tellers. "Chloe, what a surprise. You should have called. I would have taken you to dinner." I walked to the counter. I did not return the smile. I unfolded the credit report, smoothed the creases with the palm of my hand, and turned it so it faced him. I pushed it across the laminate surface. It stopped inches from the brass ledger. I applied for an apartment today. The leasing agent ran a background check. It seems I currently hold a commercial lease on a Caterpillar backhoe, 2 maxed-out corporate lines of credit, and 14 unpaid vendor invoices. Richard looked at the top page. He did not flinch. His breathing did not change. He reached up, adjusted the wire rim glasses on his nose, and let his eyes scan the numbers. I waited for the apology. I waited for the panic of a man caught in a desperate mistake. He sighed, a short, dismissive sound, and pushed the paper back toward me. "That is the custodial trust. We talked about this when you were 14. It is a family investment. The business needed a capital injection to bridge a slow quarter." He said it with the casual tone of someone discussing a weather forecast. "You forged my signature as a primary guarantor on $142,000 of commercial debt. That is not an investment. That is identity theft." A door opened at the back of the office. My mother, Susan, walked out holding a stack of invoices. She stopped when she saw me. She looked from my face to the paper on the counter. She knew exactly what it was. She set the invoices down and crossed her arms. "Do not use that word in this building." "Chloe." Susan walked to stand next to my father, presenting a united front. She leaned against the counter, her jaw set tight. "We put food on your table for 18 years. We paid for your braces. We kept a roof over your head. You were not even using your credit score. You are sitting in a dorm room studying history. We are trying to keep a 30-year-old business from going under." I looked at my mother. The math of her love was staggering. She viewed raising a child not as a duty, but as a billable service. They had kept an internal tab of my existence and decided to collect the balance by bankrupting my 20s. Before I could respond, the front door chimed again. A wave of expensive floral perfume cut through the sawdust air. My older sister Ashley walked in. She wore a silk blouse, tailored white trousers, and oversized sunglasses. She held 2 iced coffees in cardboard carriers and 3 shopping bags from a high-end boutique downtown. She lowered her sunglasses, looking at me with mild irritation, as if my presence was a scheduling error. "Nobody told me you were coming to town, Chloe." She set the designer bags on a display barrel of roofing nails. The glossy paper rustled. I stared at the bags. Then I looked at the 12-page report on the counter. Ashley was 23. She had an unblemished credit score. She lived in a luxury apartment downtown. She drove the new SUV parked out front. I turned back to Richard. My voice dropped an octave, settling into a cold, steady rhythm. "If the business needed capital, why did you not use Ashley? She is older. She was an adult when the loans were finalized. Why is her social security number not on this paper?" Richard let out a breath and shook his head, looking at me as if I was failing to grasp a simple concept. "Ashley is delicate. She needs stability to focus on her career. You have always been the resilient one, the backup plan. You figure things out, Chloe. You always land on your feet. It is just a temporary hold. We will pay it off when the fourth quarter receipts come in. The backup plan." The words hung in the air, mixing with the smell of Ashley's perfume and the stale coffee. They had not chosen me because I was strong. They had chosen me because they deemed me expendable. My sister was an asset to be protected. I was a resource to be mined. I looked at Ashley. She was busy peeling the condensation off her iced coffee cup, entirely unbothered by the conversation. She did not know what was on the paper, and she did not care, so long as her shopping bags remained full and her life remained pristine. I placed my hand flat on the credit report. "You have 30 days. Richard frowned. 30 days for what? 30 days to liquidate your inventory. Sell the trucks. Sell the backhoe. Empty whatever hidden accounts you track in that brass ledger. You will pay off every single cent of this $142,000, and you will close the trust." Susan let out a sharp, mocking laugh. "Or what? You will throw a tantrum. Or I walk into the Shreveport Police Precinct and file a felony fraud report against both of you." The office went dead silent. Even Ashley stopped peeling her cup. Richard looked at me. Really looked at me. He was searching for the bluff, scanning my posture for a tremor, a crack, a sign of the obedient 14-year-old girl who had signed a piece of paper on a kitchen counter. He found nothing. He reached out and tapped the thick brass corner of his shadow ledger. A slow, condescending smile spread across his face. "You are 19 years old, Chloe. You live in a dorm. You eat cafeteria food. We are your parents. Family does not turn on family. You are upset right now, and I understand that, but you are not going to the police. Now go back to Baton Rouge. Let the adults handle the business." He turned his back to me and walked toward the rear office. Susan picked up her invoices and followed him, throwing one last look of disappointment over her shoulder. Ashley took a sip of her coffee, picked up her designer bags, and walked out the front door without saying a word. I stood alone in the office. I looked at the brass ledger on the counter. I folded my credit report, put it in my pocket, and walked out into the heat. My father was right about one thing. I was 19 years old. But he was wrong about the rest. The clock had started ticking. And I was already calculating the distance to the nearest police precinct. 30 days is a precise measurement of time, 720 hours. For an entire month, I woke up at 6 in the morning, sat at the tiny laminate desk in my Baton Rouge dorm room, and logged into my credit monitoring portal. The screen always loaded with the same sluggish delay. The numbers never changed. My father did not liquidate his inventory. He did not sell the yellow forklifts. My mother did not call to negotiate a payment plan. They operated under the assumption that I was a frightened teenager making empty threats. On the morning of the 31st day, the screen loaded faster. The total balance was no longer $142,650. It was $146,650. A new hard inquiry had hit my file overnight. A regional industrial supply vendor had approved a $4,000 commercial line of credit using my Social Security number. Richard had not just ignored my ultimatum, he had driven past it, using my identity to finance a new condenser unit for a client project. He believed my compliance was a permanent condition. I closed the laptop. I did not pack a bag. I put my car keys in my pocket and drove back to Shreveport. I did not go to the construction supply yard this time. I drove straight to the Central Police Precinct on Texas Street. The lobby smelled of ozone, floor wax, and stale sweat. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a sickly green pallor across the waiting area. I sat on a hard wooden bench for 2 hours before a desk sergeant called my name. He directed me to a small interrogation room down a narrow hallway. A financial crimes detective named Hayes sat across from me. He looked tired. He wore a rumpled gray suit and kept clicking a retractable pen. I slid the 12-page credit report across the metal table. I placed the new $4,000 inquiry on top. He read the documents in silence. The clicking of his pen stopped. He looked at my date of birth, then at the dates of the initial commercial leases. He leaned back in his chair and exhaled a long breath. "These are corporate liabilities attached to a custodial business trust," he said, his voice carrying the rough gravel of a lifelong smoker. "The primary guarantor listed here is Richard Moore. The secondary is Susan Moore. You are the collateral sponsor." "I was 14 when they established the trust," I replied. "I was a minor. I did not have the legal capacity to underwrite heavy machinery." Detective Hayes tapped the paper. "If you file a formal affidavit of identity theft and bank fraud, this goes to the district attorney. It leaves my desk and enters the federal system. Warrants will be issued. Business assets will be seized during the investigation. You are initiating criminal proceedings against your own parents. Do you understand what that means?" I looked at the scuff marks on the metal table. I thought about Ashley, peeling the condensation off her iced coffee cup, her designer shopping bags resting on a barrel of roofing nails. I thought about the $4,000 charge processed just hours after my deadline expired. "I understand what not filing it means for me," I said. Hayes nodded once. He slid an official affidavit across the table. I picked up his pen and signed my name. The ink was black. The stroke was steady. He took the paper, stamped it with a heavy rubber seal, and handed me the pink carbon copy. Case number 482-9. I left the precinct and drove to an office supply store on Yory Drive. I walked down the aisles with singular focus. I purchased a 3-inch heavy-duty binder, solid black. I bought a box of clear sheet protectors, a set of index tabs, and 3 red pens. I sat in my car in the parking lot and assembled the binder. Tab 1, Year 1. I slid the pink carbon copy of the police report into the first plastic sleeve. It was the genesis of a ledger. My father kept a brass-cornered book to hide his sins. I would keep a black binder to document my survival. A retaliation arrived before I reached the Baton Rouge city limits. My phone lit up on the passenger seat. 3 missed calls from my mother. Then, a voicemail notification. I did not listen to it in the car. I waited until I was sitting on the floor of my new living space. My dorm contract had ended for the summer, and I had secured a cheap sublet in a decaying apartment complex near the train tracks. The room had no furniture, just a roll-out camping mat and a single hot plate resting on the kitchen counter. I placed the phone on the bare linoleum floor and pressed play. Susan did not yell. Her voice was cold, vibrating with a quiet, lethal venom. She spoke for 4 minutes and 12 seconds. She called me a traitor. She detailed every dollar they had ever spent on my existence, from pediatric copays to the gasoline in my sedan. She told me I was dead to them. She stated that Richard had suffered a mild angina attack because of the shock of the police inquiry. She blamed me for his heart condition. She officially banned me from the family home, revoking my status as a Moore. When the recording ended, I did not delete it. I opened my laptop. I put on a pair of cheap headphones. I played the audio again, pausing every few seconds. I opened a blank document and typed out her words. Every insult, every manipulated fact, every threat. I stripped the emotion out of her voice and turned her rage into clinical data. I printed the transcription. I punched 3 holes in the paper. I wrote the date in red pen at the top right corner. I slid it into the black binder. Item 2, voicemail transcript. Disownment confirmed. An hour later, the family group chat ignited. The detective had clearly made contact. Richard had initiated a spin campaign. My phone buzzed in rapid succession. Aunt Gloria sent a sprawling paragraph calling me a vindictive, ungrateful child who was trying to ruin a proud family legacy. Uncle Thomas accused me of elder abuse. Cousins who had not spoken to me in 5 years sent single-word messages. Disgusting. Shameful. Nobody asked for my side of the story. The narrative was set. The construction supply business was a sacred cow, and I was the heretic trying to slaughter it. I did not type a single defense. I took screenshots of every message. I printed them. I labeled them with the red pen. Item 3. Character assassination. Extended family excommunication. I closed the heavy rings of the binder. The metal snapped shut with a satisfying, definitive click. The next morning, I walked to the campus credit union to withdraw money for groceries. I handed my debit card to the teller. She swiped it, frowned, and swiped it again. She looked at her monitor, then looked at me with an expression of polite pity. "Your accounts are locked," she said. I asked for clarification. She explained the mechanics of federal fraud protocols. When a citizen files a felony identity theft report involving hundreds of thousands of dollars, banking algorithms engage a scorched earth defense. To protect the victim, the system freezes every financial instrument attached to that Social Security number. My checking account, my meager savings from my campus jobs, everything was locked behind an indefinite investigative hold. I thanked her, took my plastic card, and walked out. I had exactly $12 in cash in my wallet. I went to a discount grocery store. I bought a 10-pound bag of white rice and a flat of dried pinto beans. I carried them back to the sublet. The Louisiana summer heat radiated through the thin walls of the apartment. The air conditioning unit was broken. I filled a cheap aluminum pot with water, set it on the electric hot plate, and poured in a cup of rice. I sat cross-legged on the peeling linoleum. The black binder rested beside me. I was 19 years old. I had no family. I had no access to the financial grid. I had a ruined credit score, a target on my back, and a pot of boiling water. I looked at the solid black cover of the ledger. The fear drained out of my chest, replaced by something hard and structural. They had taken my resources, but they had also handed me an ultimate liberation. I owed them nothing. The boiling water hissed against the hot plate. I had survived the fracture. The real question was how a teenager with a frozen identity was going to build an empire out of ashes. 4 years is an immense duration to live as a ghost within the American financial system. When your Social Security number carries the stain of high-level identity theft, society locks its gates. The consequences were immediate and relentless. I could not secure a standard residential lease. Landlords took one glance at my background check and showed me the door. I could not establish basic utilities in my name. The electric company demanded a staggering deposit I did not possess. I bought a prepaid cellular phone with cash, reloading the minutes each month like a transient. To fund my tuition and the rent for my sparse sublet, I required employment that bypassed deep corporate vetting. A local data processing center needed a graveyard shift monitor. The position paid a fraction above minimum wage. From midnight until 8 in the morning, I sat in a freezing, cavernous server room. The air conditioning ran constantly to cool the mainframes. The environment smelled of ozone and hot dust. I watched endless lines of green code scroll across black monitors. I was isolated, unseen, and buried under an avalanche of fabricated liabilities. My parents dealt in hardware. They sold tangible items: treated lumber, concrete blocks, steel rebar, and heavy machinery. They utilized me as a blunt instrument, a convenient wrench to pry open a vault and salvage their crumbling foundation. But physical tools degrade, they rust. I decided to construct my salvation from a different material entirely: software. Code does not succumb to family guilt. Algorithms do not care about legacy. Code is pure logic. During the daylight hours, I attended university lectures. Between classes, I retreated to the deepest, quietest corner of the campus library. I surrounded myself with heavy, leather-bound volumes of financial law. I studied the Fair Credit Reporting Act until my vision blurred. I mapped the intricate pathways of corporate liability, seeking a flaw in the armor of the credit bureaus. It was during one of these exhaustive library sessions that Wyatt noticed my routine. Wyatt was a senior majoring in computer science. He possessed a quiet, highly analytical nature, functioning with the steady precision of a metronome. He favored plain gray hooded sweatshirts and wire-framed glasses. He spoke only when necessary, avoiding trivial conversations. One Tuesday in late November, I was staring at a labyrinthine clause regarding custodial trust liability. Wyatt stopped by my table. He looked at the imposing stack of dispute denial letters I had received from the 3 major credit bureaus. The letters were identical, citing automated verification protocols. "You are fighting a machine with handwritten letters," he said. His voice was calm, devoid of pity. Pity was a useless currency. Pity did not pay debts or clear derogatory marks. I explained the situation. I outlined the $146,000. I detailed the custodial business trust my father had exploited. Wyatt listened without interrupting. He did not offer empty platitudes. He did not say he was sorry for my predicament. Empathy was not his primary language. Efficiency was. He pulled out a chair, opened his laptop, and asked a single, piercing question. What is the specific legal loophole? I pointed to a dense paragraph in the federal code. A custodial trust requires annual recertification of the primary guarantor once the collateral sponsor reaches the age of majority. Richard never filed that mandatory recertification. Legally, the debt renewals processed after my 18th birthday were structurally invalid. The contracts were void. However, the credit bureaus processed thousands of dispute pages a minute. They summarily rejected manual challenges because their automated optical scanners only searched for matching signatures, ignoring the sequential age verification requirements. Wyatt adjusted his glasses, staring at the text. "So we blind the scanners," he said. "We force human review." We became architects of a digital siege. Wyatt wrote a custom Python script. I provided the precise legal verbiage. Instead of mailing one polite dispute letter every 30 days, the software generated hundreds of legally binding, strategically formatted challenges per week. We targeted the exact processing loophole, formatting the text to trigger the Bureau's internal compliance flags, overwhelming their automated systems until federal regulations mandated a manual audit by a human underwriter. We launched the offensive in the spring. For months, the corporate conglomerates pushed back. The data center night shifts funded the certified mail postage. Wyatt optimized the code. I tracked the responses, categorizing every victory and setback. We functioned as a synchronized unit. While I fought a daily war of attrition against faceless algorithms, my blood relatives engaged in a different kind of campaign. They weaponized milestones. My college graduation arrived on a sweltering May afternoon. The air was thick with humidity. I walked across the stage, accepted my diploma in logistics management, and looked out at the vast sea of folding chairs arranged on the university lawn. The crowd was a blur of cheering families, bright balloons, and waving hands. I searched for Section 4, Row J, seats 12, 13, and 14. I had mailed the commencement invitations, knowing they would likely ignore them. It was a calculated test, a calibration of their current hostility. All 3 chairs remained empty. No mother, no father, no sister. 2 weeks later, the exact nature of that absence was clarified. Ashley graduated with her master's degree in public relations from a private university in Texas. I learned about the event through a mutual acquaintance who posted the updates online. Richard and Susan rented out the grand ballroom of a historic Shreveport hotel. They hired a 10-piece brass band, a professional photographer, and a premium catering service. The estimated cost of the celebration was $15,000. They possessed the liquidity to throw an opulent party for the golden child, yet claimed desperate poverty when confronted with the catastrophic debt they had anchored to my name. I did not shed a single tear over the contrast. I logged onto the internet, found the public photographs of the event, and printed them. I gathered the receipt for my own rented graduation cap and gown. I uncapped my red pen. Item 42, college graduation, parents absent. Item 43, sister degree celebration, $15,000 expended. I punched holes in the paper. I placed the documents into the black binder. The heavy metal rings snapped shut. The ledger was growing incredibly thick, serving as a physical manifestation of an undeniable truth. The binder was my armor, ensuring I would never suffer from amnesia regarding their true nature. The pivotal turning point occurred during my 4th year of systemic isolation. Wyatt and I were sitting in my sublet, eating takeout noodles on the linoleum floor. The Louisiana rain battered the thin window panes. I opened my laptop and refreshed the credit monitoring portal. The screen loaded. The persistent red warning banners were gone. The fraudulent commercial accounts, the backhoe lease, the heavy machinery lines of credit, all of them had vanished. They were wiped out, expunged by the relentless pressure of our automated legal barrage and the undeniable evidence of the uncertified trust. My credit score read 752. I stared at the 3 digits. The breath caught in my throat. I had reclaimed my identity. The grueling survival phase was officially over. I possessed a clean slate, a university degree, and a proven methodology for dismantling corporate processing errors. Wyatt looked at the screen, then looked at me. His analytical mind was already turning gears, calculating the broader implications of our victory. We just beat 3 multi-billion-dollar conglomerates using a laptop and a Python script, he said. I nodded, the profound realization settling deep into my bones. If my parents could weaponize a legal loophole to destroy my foundation, how many other innocent people were drowning under the weight of similar systemic failures? We possessed the exact blueprint required to fix it. We had the code. We had the legal strategy. The trauma had forged an unbreakable shield. Now it was time to forge a sword. We were not just going to survive in the shadows anymore. We were going to build an empire. The question was, how long would it take for the ghosts of Shreveport to notice the formidable fortune I was about to create? We packed our lives into a rented moving truck on a humid Tuesday morning and drove south. Baton Rouge held too many echoes of locked bank accounts and cafeteria survival. Shreveport remained a toxic perimeter we refused to cross. New Orleans offered a different architecture. The city possessed a robust corporate financial sector, a deep harbor of commerce, and enough noise to swallow 2 people who wanted to build something formidable in the shadows. We leased a small, drafty office above a commercial bakery in the French Quarter. The air constantly smelled of burning sugar and chicory coffee. The floorboards sloped and the window units rattled when the humidity peaked. This was the birthplace of ClearPath Financial. Wyatt and I did not intend to run a consumer hotline. We were not interested in fielding desperate calls from individuals seeking quick fixes for unpaid credit cards. We targeted the source of the rot. ClearPath Financial operated strictly as a business-to-business risk compliance and corporate underwriting software firm. We built a proprietary platform that allowed regional banks, commercial lenders, and corporate vendors to scrub their portfolios for systemic processing errors, custodial trust liabilities, and hidden fraud flags. We sold them the digital immune system my parents had bypassed. The growth was methodical, dictated by pure mathematics. In year 1, we secured 50 corporate clients. I managed the sales division, utilizing the stark, irrefutable data from my own survival to pitch our algorithms to risk managers. Wyatt operated as the sole developer, refining the code until it ran with lethal efficiency. Those initial 50 contracts stabilized our existence. We moved out of the sublet and rented a modest duplex in the Garden District. By year 3, the momentum accelerated. The software proved highly effective at catching catastrophic liability gaps before they matured into federal fines. Small lending institutions recommended us to larger regional banks. We acquired 400 corporate clients. The drafty room above the bakery was abandoned. We signed a commercial lease for a sleek, glass-walled space in the Central Business District. We hired a dedicated team of junior financial analysts, compliance officers, and server engineers. Year 5 shifted the trajectory of our entire lives. A private equity firm based in Texas audited our operational metrics and offered a multi-million-dollar valuation. We retained full ownership, but the influx of venture capital allowed us to scale across the southern states. I assumed the role of Chief Executive Officer. I signed the federal tax forms, managed the corporate board, and navigated the endless maze of banking regulations. Wyatt claimed the title of Chief Technology Officer. He preferred the silence of the server architecture over the noise of the boardroom. Our partnership was seamless. We operated on a shared frequency of logic and mutual reliance. We did not require grand romantic gestures to validate our bond. We required loyalty. When we decided to formalize the relationship, we applied for a marriage license in Orleans Parish. The ceremony took place on a quiet Thursday morning at the municipal courthouse. The sky was overcast, threatening a late summer downpour. I wore a tailored ivory dress purchased off the rack. Wyatt wore a charcoal suit. 10 people stood behind us in the small civic chamber. They were our senior software engineers, our lead legal counsel, and the original investors who believed in the platform when it was just a script running on a dorm room laptop. They were the people who showed up when servers crashed at 2 a.m. They were the chosen family. No engraved invitations were mailed to northern Louisiana. My parents were not informed of the event. Ashley remained oblivious to the fact that her younger sister was reciting vows. The silence was a deliberate architectural choice. I did not want the ghosts of Shreveport lingering in the room. We celebrated the union with a quiet lunch at a corner bistro, sharing plates of roasted fish and sparkling water. By 3 p.m, we were back at the corporate office, reviewing a critical software patch. It was a perfect, contained day. However, scaling a multi-million-dollar enterprise inevitably generates a dangerous byproduct: visibility. In the corporate financial sector, quiet success is the preferred operational mode. But when a software firm begins monopolizing the risk compliance market, the industry press pays attention. A prominent regional business journal, headquartered in Baton Rouge, submitted a formal request for a feature interview. I initially declined. I preferred anonymity. Our marketing director staged an intervention, arguing that a cover feature would secure 2 highly lucrative underwriting contracts we were currently negotiating with state banks. Logic dictated that I accept. They dispatched a professional photographer and a senior economic journalist to our headquarters. 2 months later, the quarterly issue hit the stands. I walked into a premium coffee shop in the lobby of our office building. I approached the register to pay for my dark roast. I glanced at the Wire magazine rack near the entrance. My own face stared back at me. The photograph was crisp, captured under harsh studio lighting. I was wearing a tailored navy blazer, standing in front of the frosted glass wall of our boardroom. I looked unbothered, commanding, and expensive. The headline was printed in bold silver typography: "The Credit Savior." The lead article spanned 6 pages. It detailed the rapid ascent of ClearPath Financial, our current market valuation, and our innovative methodology for untangling custodial fraud. It praised my resilience and strategic vision. It was a public coronation of my success. I purchased a single copy. I walked into the elevator, rode to the penthouse floor, and bypassed the reception desk. I walked straight into my office and closed the solid oak door. I did not frame the glossy cover for the lobby wall. I did not send a copy to our investors. I opened the bottom drawer of my mahogany desk. The black binder rested there, heavy and waiting. I flipped past the pink carbon copy of the police report, past the voicemail transcripts, past the printed photographs of the empty graduation chairs. I took a heavy-duty 3-hole punch, aligned the edge of the magazine cover, and pressed down. I placed the article into a clear plastic sleeve. Item 71, Public Visibility Achieved. I closed the rings. I picked up my desktop phone and buzzed Wyatt. He walked into my office a moment later, holding a tablet. I slid the magazine across the polished wood surface. He read the silver headline. His jaw tightened. He understood the mathematics of my family better than anyone alive. Success in Louisiana is not a well-kept secret. Information travels through industrial supply chains, country club locker rooms, and small-town gossip networks faster than fiber optic signals. Contact the security firm we use for the server farm, I told him. Tell them I want a residential assessment by tomorrow morning. Wyatt set his tablet down. You think they will come here? I tapped the glossy cover. The Moore Construction Supply Yard was bleeding capital. The physical hardware market was shifting, and Richard lacked the agility and the cash reserves to adapt. They were drowning in a swamp of their own making. Word will reach Shreveport by Friday, I said. I knew my father. He did not read sophisticated business journals, but his regional vendors did. His distressed bankers did. It was a mathematical certainty that someone would drop this exact magazine onto his sales counter, tap the photograph, and ask if the wealthy software executive down in New Orleans was his estranged daughter. I instructed Wyatt to upgrade the deadbolts on our front doors. I wanted biometric locks installed. I ordered high-definition perimeter cameras for the house and the corporate office. I fortified our physical boundaries to match our digital ones. The ghost they had created at 19 had materialized into a highly profitable target at 24. The survival phase was officially concluded. The magazine was currently sitting on newsstands across the entire state. The collision was no longer a hypothetical scenario. It was a geographic inevitability, moving steadily south toward my door. The process server arrived on a rainy Thursday morning. He wore a damp coat and bypassed the premium coffee shop on the ground floor, navigating straight to the executive elevators. He stepped onto the penthouse level and handed a thick manila envelope to my receptionist. I was sitting in my office reviewing a quarterly compliance audit when the receptionist knocked and placed the envelope on my mahogany desk. The return address belonged to a discount legal practice situated in a Shreveport strip mall. The paper was cheap. The text was dense with aggressive legal posturing. It was a formal cease and desist order, accompanied by an intent to sue for defamation of character and tortious interference with business relations. 5 years had passed since I walked into the police precinct and filed the felony fraud report. Time creates an illusion of safety for people who refuse to acknowledge their own misdeeds. Richard and Susan had hit a financial wall. The construction supply business was hemorrhaging capital. Regional housing developments were slowing down, and their inventory was gathering dust in the gravel yard. They required a commercial bridge loan to cover their vendor invoices and meet payroll. They assumed the passage of time had diluted the consequences of their actions. They were incorrect. In the corporate banking sector, a late payment on a personal credit card might fall off a record after 7 years. A formal police affidavit detailing felony identity theft and commercial bank fraud does not fade. It attaches to a corporate entity like a permanent anchor. When the regional bank ran the underwriting algorithm for the bridge loan, the 5-year-old pink carbon copy sitting in my black binder tripped the security alarm. The bank denied the capital injection. My parents needed a scapegoat for their failing enterprise. They hired a low-tier attorney to construct a narrative of victimhood. The legal demand in the envelope was explicit. I was instructed to sign a notarized affidavit stating that the original police report was filed under emotional distress. I was expected to swear that the identity theft was a simple familial misunderstanding, and I had to formally retract the accusation with the authorities. If I failed to comply within 10 business days, they would file a civil lawsuit seeking financial damages, claiming my false report had ruined their business reputation. I read the document twice. I did not feel a spike of adrenaline. I did not experience the crushing weight of anxiety. At 19 years old, a legal threat from my father would have paralyzed my nervous system. At 24, sitting at the helm of a multi-million-dollar software firm, it felt like watching an amateur attempt to breach a steel vault with a plastic spoon. I picked up my phone and buzzed Wyatt. I asked him to meet me in the main glass boardroom. I also summoned our lead corporate litigator, a seasoned attorney named Harrison. We gathered around the long conference table. Harrison adjusted his glasses, reading the demand letter in silence. He pointed out 3 distinct typographical errors in the Shreveport attorney formatting. He placed the paper down and asked how I wished to proceed. He offered standard options, suggesting we could ignore the threat or send a boilerplate denial. I leaned back in my chair. I explained that we would not ignore the letter. We were going to welcome the lawsuit. Defamation is a specific legal concept. It hinges entirely on the concept of falsehood. To win a defamation claim, the plaintiff must prove that the defendant lied. Truth is the ultimate impenetrable shield against the charge. Furthermore, in American civil litigation, attempting to prove the truth unlocks the gates of legal discovery. It grants the defense the power to demand extensive internal records. I instructed Harrison to prepare a response that would bury their discount attorney under a mountain of procedural mandates. We would demand a decade of certified corporate tax returns. We would request every vendor invoice from the year I turned 18. We would require the minutes of every board meeting detailing the inception of the custodial trust. Then I delivered the killing blow. I described a heavy, dark green book with ribbed binding and thick brass corners. I detailed its exact location, hidden on a low shelf beneath the laminate counter at the Shreveport supply yard. I told Harrison to draft a highly specific, undeniable subpoena for the off-the-books accounting ledger. Harrison smiled, a thin, predatory expression indicating he understood the exact geometry of the trap we were building. Wyatt nodded from across the table, recognizing the precision of the countermeasure. The corporate legal team worked through the weekend. They drafted a response that was 84 pages long. It was a masterpiece of legal intimidation, packed with binding federal precedents and exhaustive discovery demands. The document made it explicitly clear that a lawsuit would result in a forensic dissection of the Moore construction supply business by a team of elite corporate auditors. We shipped the response to the strip mall attorney via an overnight courier. The reaction was incredibly swift. Richard was a man who operated entirely in the shadows. He utilized fake trusts, hidden accounts, and manipulated inventory logs to project an illusion of wealth and stability. The prospect of a forensic corporate auditor prying open his brass ledger, exposing decades of tax evasion, and handing that evidence to a federal judge terrified him beyond measure. 3 days after the courier delivered our response, a single-page fax transmitted to our office machine. The defamation claim was withdrawn with extreme prejudice. The cease and desist order was formally rescinded. The Shreveport attorney dropped the matter entirely, signaling a complete and unconditional surrender. The legal battle lasted less than 96 hours. I took the original threat, our 84-page response, and the single-page surrender document. I walked back into my private office and opened the bottom drawer of my desk. I pulled out the heavy-duty 3-hole punch. I aligned the edges of the legal paper and pressed down. The metal cylinders cut through the pages with a sharp crunch. I uncapped my red pen and wrote the date in the upper right corner. Item 72, defamation lawsuit attempt, defeated. I slid the documents into a clear plastic sleeve inside the black binder. The rings snapped shut. The interaction confirmed a dangerous new reality. My parents were watching my ascent. The magazine cover had alerted them to the vast resources I now commanded, and their failing business made them increasingly desperate. They had attempted to utilize the legal system to bully me into submission, relying on the outdated dynamic of parental authority and intimidation. They failed, discovering firsthand that the resilient backup plan they discarded now possessed a lethal corporate defense mechanism. But desperate people do not simply surrender and walk away when their initial tactic fails. They pivot. They search for softer targets to exploit. If they could not force me to fund their survival through direct legal threats, they would have to find a different source of capital to drain. The quiet resolution of the lawsuit was not a victory. It was merely the calm preceding a much larger storm. I looked at the closed binder, wondering what underhanded tactic they would attempt to deploy next. 9 months after the defamation lawsuit dissolved into silence, the internet delivered the next chapter of my family history. I was sitting at my kitchen island on a Sunday morning, drinking black coffee and reviewing a risk assessment file for a new client. I picked up my phone to check a weather alert. A social media notification occupied the center of the screen. A mutual acquaintance from Shreveport had tagged my sister in an album containing 42 high-resolution photographs. Ashley had gotten married. I tapped the screen and opened the digital album. I did not feel a sudden rush of sadness. I felt the cold, familiar onset of an underwriter analyzing a severely mismatched balance sheet. The photographs documented an event of staggering opulence. The venue was a historic plantation estate situated just outside the city limits. Ancient oak trees draped in Spanish moss framed the ceremony space. I scrolled through the images, my mind automatically cataloging the expenses. I saw a 10-piece brass band dressed in matching formal wear. I saw tables draped in imported silk linens, adorned with floral arrangements that required a commercial greenhouse to produce. I saw a 7-tier cake trimmed in edible gold leaf. Then I saw the portraits. Ashley wore a custom designer gown featuring a cathedral-length train and intricate beadwork. Richard stood beside her in a premium rented tuxedo, beaming with the pride of a patriarch who had spared no expense. Susan wore a tailored silver dress, holding a lace handkerchief, posing for the camera with rehearsed grace. I sat alone in my kitchen, studying the faces of the people who had attempted to sue me for defamation just to secure a bridge loan. They claimed their construction supply yard was on the brink of insolvency. They blamed my 5-year-old police report for their lack of operating capital. Yet, the photographic evidence displayed a minimum expenditure of $60,000. I was not invited. I had not received a save-the-date card. I had not received a phone call. I was a phantom, erased from the family narrative. My phone buzzed in my hand. A text message arrived from Cousin Amy. She was a peripheral relative who rarely engaged in the family group chat, preferring to observe the chaos from a safe distance. The message was brief. Everyone noticed you were not at the reception. Your father gave a toast. He told the extended family you were invited, but chose not to come. He said you were too busy acting superior down in New Orleans to celebrate your own sister. I read the text twice. Richard had not simply excluded me. He had weaponized my absence. He utilized my corporate success to paint me as an elitist villain, shielding himself from any uncomfortable questions regarding our estrangement. He controlled the narrative, casting himself as the generous, wounded father of an ungrateful software executive. I did not type a defensive reply. I did not attempt to correct the record. Arguing with a smear campaign validates the premise. Instead, I stood up, walked to my home office, and connected my laptop to the wireless printer. I printed the photographs of the plantation venue, the brass band, and the towering cake. I printed the text message from Cousin Amy. I pulled the black binder from my desk drawer. I uncapped my red pen. Item 73. Sister wedding. Uninvited. Narrative manipulation confirmed. Estimated cost $60,000. I punched holes in the glossy paper and secured them in the heavy metal rings. The ledger accepted the new data, growing thicker, a tangible record of their hypocrisy. The true anomaly of the situation arrived 3 days later. I received a phone call from Sarah, a girl I had known in high school who now managed a premium bridal boutique in downtown Shreveport. Sarah and I were not close friends, but she possessed a sharp memory and a talent for recognizing structural inconsistencies. She called under the guise of catching up, but her tone indicated a specific agenda. She mentioned that Ashley had visited her boutique several weeks prior to the wedding to purchase a selection of high-end accessories, a crystal hair vine, a customized veil, and a set of pearl earrings. The total transaction amounted to roughly $1,400. Sarah lowered her voice, speaking with the hushed cadence of someone sharing classified intel. Ashley brought her personal platinum card to the register. I ran the chip. It declined. The terminal displayed a hard code error, insufficient funds, or frozen account status. Ashley turned pale. She started digging through her purse, looking frantic. Your mother was standing right there. Susan stepped in immediately, pushed Ashley aside, and handed me a thick stack of $100 bills. Susan told me it was a weird bank error, a security flag for out-of-state spending, and told me to process the cash. I thanked Sarah for the conversation and ended the call. I sat in my office chair, staring at the wall. The math did not align. Ashley was a 23-year-old public relations manager at a mid-tier firm. She earned a respectable salary. She did not have a mortgage. Her luxury vehicle was purchased in cash by our father. She should possess ample liquidity to cover a $1,400 bridal purchase. A personal platinum card does not generate a hard code decline unless the debt-to-income ratio has suffered a catastrophic rupture. Susan, brushing it off as a weird bank error, was the exact language she used when my own accounts started failing at 19. I wrote Sarah's anecdote on a sheet of legal paper. I noted the date, the boutique location, and the specific terminal error code. I filed it in the black binder right behind the wedding photographs. It was a puzzle piece. It did not form a complete picture yet, but it suggested a structural fracture beneath the pristine surface of my sister's life. That evening, I shared the wedding expenditure and the boutique incident with Wyatt over dinner. He listened quietly, cutting his steak with methodical precision. He processed the variables: a failing construction business, a withdrawn defamation lawsuit, a $60,000 cash wedding, a declined credit card. They are moving money through unseen channels, he said. They spent capital they do not actually possess. The facade is cracking. The next morning, Wyatt did not go straight to the corporate office. He drove to a specialized hardware supplier in the Garden District. He purchased a set of commercial-grade biometric deadbolts and shatterproof window films. He spent the entire Saturday reinforcing the physical perimeter of our home. He replaced the standard brass locks with steel-reinforced cylinders. He understood the physics of a collapsing structure. When a building falls, the debris radiates outward. He was making certain our perimeter could withstand the impact. We returned to our standard corporate routine. The days blurred into a rhythm of compliance audits, software updates, and board meetings. The wedding faded into the background noise of the Louisiana summer. I assumed they had secured a predatory loan to fund the plantation celebration and were currently managing the high-interest fallout in Shreveport. I was wrong. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon. The sky outside the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse office was a bruised, heavy purple, threatening a Gulf storm. I was finalizing a massive underwriting contract for a new banking client. The digital clock on my monitor read 2:14. The intercom on my mahogany desk emitted a sharp, buzzing tone. I pressed the silver receiver button. My receptionist spoke. Her voice was usually a model of polished corporate neutrality, but I detected a faint tremor of uncertainty in her cadence. Ms. Moore, I apologize for the interruption. There are 2 individuals in the front lobby requesting an immediate audience with you. They bypassed security protocols by claiming a family emergency. I kept my finger on the button. My pulse remained steady. What are their names? They say they are Richard and Susan Moore. They said they are your parents. I released the button. The intercom clicked off. The corporate suite went entirely silent. 8 years. 8 years of weaponized silence, returned birthday cards, defamation threats, and public excommunication. They had spent nearly a decade pretending I was a ghost, treating my existence as an inconvenient stain on their proud family legacy. I looked at the locked bottom drawer of my desk. I thought about the $60,000 wedding and the declined platinum card. The math was finally calling in its debts. The ghosts had traveled 300 miles south, past the biometric locks and the security cameras, to stand in my lobby. The only remaining question was what specific brand of desperation possessed enough gravity to force Richard and Susan Moore to finally show their faces in the light. I unlocked the bottom right drawer of my executive desk. The metal locking mechanism disengaged with a dull thud. I reached inside and withdrew the black binder. It possessed significant physical weight now, swollen with nearly a decade of documented betrayals, legal threats, and printed photographs. I held it against my side, smoothed the front of my tailored navy blazer, and walked out of my private office. The corporate suite operated at a steady, efficient hum. Analysts typed on dual monitors. Legal associates reviewed digital contracts in hushed tones. I walked down the central corridor toward the main reception area. My empire was built on data, algorithms, and impenetrable boundaries. I was about to introduce the architects of my initial ruin into the sterile environment they forced me to create. I reached the primary glass-walled conference room. I did not pause to regulate my breathing. I pushed the heavy glass door open and stepped inside. Richard and Susan sat on opposite sides of the long mahogany table. They looked remarkably small against the backdrop of the New Orleans skyline, visible through the panoramic windows. The past 8 years had extracted a visible toll. Richard possessed deeper lines around his eyes and a gray pallor to his skin. He wore a suit that appeared slightly dated, the lapels frayed at the edges. Susan sat rigidly, clutching a designer handbag that seemed too pristine for her current posture. Her face was tense, coated in a layer of defensive makeup. They did not stand when I entered. They did not rush forward to embrace the daughter they had not seen in nearly 3,000 days. They did not utter a single apology for the felony identity theft, the weaponized silence, the defamation lawsuit, or the opulent wedding I was barred from attending. Richard leaned forward, resting his forearms on the polished wood. "You have a very impressive operation here, Chloe. Must cost a fortune in overhead." His tone was casual, laced with the inherent arrogance of a patriarch inspecting a subsidiary branch of his own kingdom. He still believed he held the high ground. I did not offer them coffee. I did not sit down immediately. I placed the black binder onto the surface of the table and took the chair at the head of the boardroom. "State your business, Richard. My schedule is not flexible today." He bristled at the use of his first name. He expected deference. He expected the frightened 19-year-old girl who used to seek his approval. He reached into his jacket pocket, produced a folded financial statement, and slid it across the mahogany table. It stopped inches from my hands. "The construction supply market has experienced a severe contraction," he said, his voice dropping into a rehearsed business cadence. "Supply chain disruptions, inflated material costs. We require a capital injection to bridge the gap until the housing sector recovers. We are applying for a $1.2 million commercial loan through Delta Regional Bank." I looked at the folded paper. I did not touch it. Delta Regional was the premier commercial lender in northern Louisiana. They did not hand out seven-figure lifelines to failing hardware yards without rigorous underwriting. "And what does your commercial loan application have to do with my software firm?" Susan shifted in her chair. She unclasped her pristine handbag and pulled out a rolled-up magazine. She smoothed it flat on the table. It was the Regional Business Journal featuring my face on the cover, the credit savior. "We saw the article," Susan said. Her voice carried a thin, forced warmth. "We read about your proprietary algorithms. The journalist wrote that you fix broken credit portfolios for massive corporations. You find the errors and you erase them." Richard tapped the financial statement. Our commercial credit profile took a hit recently. A few delayed vendor payments, a misunderstanding with a previous lender. Delta Regional is going to scrutinize our history. You fix credit, Chloe. We need you to fix ours. Ensure the application sails through the automated checks. The audacity of the request hung in the climate-controlled air. They had driven 300 miles to demand a fraudulent manipulation of federal banking systems. They wanted me to utilize the exact technology I built to recover from their theft to facilitate their current survival. It was a chillingly transactional demand. I leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair. I spoke with the flat, clinical precision of a chief executive officer declining a toxic merger. ClearPath Financial is a business-to-business risk underwriting firm. We do not provide consumer credit repair. We do not manipulate active banking algorithms to hide negligent payment histories. We sell compliance software to financial institutions. You are asking for a service we do not provide, and you are asking me to risk federal indictments to do it. The answer is no. The rejection landed like a physical blow. Richard clenched his jaw. Susan immediately pivoted to her secondary tactic, the guilt playbook. Her eyes filled with theatrical tears. She pulled a lace handkerchief from her bag, dabbing at the dry corners of her eyes. "How can you sit there in your expensive suit and turn your back on us?" she whispered, letting her voice crack with engineered sorrow. "We are your parents. We raised you. We sacrificed our youth to build a business that fed you. Now we are on the verge of losing everything. And you refuse to lift a finger to help your own flesh and blood. You have all this wealth, Chloe. Family helps family." I watched her perform. The tears were hollow. The sorrow was a calculated transaction. I reached forward and pulled the black binder toward the center of the table. I flipped the heavy cover open. I bypassed the index tabs and turned directly to tab 1. I slid the open ledger toward them. The pink carbon copy of the Shreveport police affidavit rested inside a clear plastic sleeve. Next to it was the original 12-page credit report from the Baton Rouge leasing office. The total balance was highlighted in stark red ink. $142,650. "I gave it the office," I said. Susan stopped dabbing her eyes. The handkerchief fell to her lap. Richard stared at the pink carbon copy. The physical evidence of their past treason neutralized their current manipulation. They could not argue with the math. Richard swallowed hard. His arrogance evaporated, replaced by the cornered panic of a man running out of oxygen. He abandoned the emotional angle. He resorted to a desperate business negotiation. "Fine," he snapped, his voice rough and uneven. "Do not fix it. Just run the file." I raised an eyebrow. "Clarify the request." "You have the software," Richard said, leaning over the table. "You know exactly what the underwriters at Delta Regional are going to see when they pull our corporate history. Run our financial profile through your proprietary algorithm. Give us the diagnostic report. Tell us what the red flags are so we can prepare an explanation before we sit down with the loan officers. Just give us the data." I looked at the man who had forged my signature on a heavy machinery lease. I looked at the woman who had financed a $60,000 plantation wedding while claiming impending bankruptcy. I possess the technological capacity to map their entire financial footprint down to the penny. I wanted to see the architecture of their ruin. I wanted to see where the money was actually flowing. "I will run your corporate and personal files through the diagnostic matrix," I said, keeping my tone devoid of any familial concession. "But you are not a charity case. You will be processed as an external corporate consultation. My hourly rate, plus the server processing fees, amounts to a $5,000 retainer." Susan gasped. "You are going to charge your own parents $5,000 just to run a background check?" I did not blink. Payable immediately via certified wire transfer. If the funds do not clear my accounting department within 10 minutes, this meeting is concluded and security will escort you to the elevators. Richard stared at me. He recognized the immovable boundary. He pulled a sleek smartphone from his pocket, opened his banking application, and requested the routing details. He authorized the transfer in silence. 7 minutes later, my desktop monitor chimed with a notification from my finance director. The funds had cleared. They paid the ransom. They surrendered their financial privacy for a glimpse of their own risk profile. I stood up and walked toward the door. I instructed them to wait in the conference room. I told them the algorithm required 20 minutes to scrub the federal databases and compile a comprehensive risk assessment. I walked back to my private office, closed the door, and signaled Wyatt to initiate the deep diagnostic protocol. I sat in front of my dual monitors, watching the loading bar process their encrypted data. I knew the construction supply yard was failing. I knew their tax liens were severe. But algorithms do not just scan the surface, they excavate the foundation. As the progress bar reached 100%, the screen populated with a labyrinth of hidden accounts, defaulted lines of credit, and secondary guarantor liabilities. The software had unlocked the vault. I leaned closer to the monitor, my eyes scanning the data, preparing to uncover the dark, catastrophic secret my parents had been hiding in the shadows. The loading bar on my primary monitor reached 100% and vanished. The dark screen transitioned to a blinding white interface. Lines of compressed data unfurled, cascading down the dual monitors like a digital waterfall. The proprietary algorithm we designed to audit multi-billion-dollar banking portfolios was now dissecting the financial anatomy of Richard and Susan Moore. Wyatt stood behind my ergonomic leather chair. His hands rested on the backrest. The only sound in the penthouse office was the low, steady hum of the climate control system and the rhythmic clicking of my computer mouse as I navigated the diagnostic report. The initial findings were entirely predictable. The commercial construction supply yard was not merely bleeding capital. It was in a state of terminal, unrecoverable hemorrhage. The software isolated 3 massive federal tax liens filed against the physical property in Shreveport. It documented a sprawling network of delinquent vendor invoices dating back 36 months. Several primary material suppliers had already initiated aggressive litigation for breach of contract. They are bankrupt in everything but the legal filing, Wyatt noted, his voice an analytical whisper. The $1.2 million commercial loan they are seeking from Delta Regional is not a bridge loan to stabilize operations. It is a desperate exit strategy to pay off the feds before the IRS physically seizes the gravel yard. I scrolled further down the digital report, shifting from the corporate entity to their personal consumer profiles. Their individual credit scores hovered in the mid-500s, devastated by extreme debt-to-income ratios and revolving utilization rates that sat permanently at maximum capacity. They were financially radioactive. No legitimate underwriter would authorize a 7-figure capital injection based on this data. Their request for me to fix their history was not born from mild inconvenience. It was a plea for a miraculous resurrection. I prepared to compile a summary brief to hand over in the conference room. I intended to provide them with the raw, brutal mathematics of their ruin, take their $5,000 consultation fee, and escort them to the elevators. Then a red alert banner flashed across the secondary monitor. The system identified a structural anomaly. "Wait," Wyatt said, leaning closer to the screen. His finger pointed to a hidden subroutine in the liability matrix. Click on the cross-collateralization tab. Expand the secondary guarantor section. I shifted the cursor and executed the command. A hidden directory opened. The software had mapped 5 separate, heavily defaulted commercial accounts. 2 were massive corporate revolving credit lines utilized for purchasing raw lumber. 1 was an equipment lease for 3 commercial delivery trucks. The The remaining 2 were unsecured personal loans disguised as business capital injections. The total outstanding balance across all 5 accounts was $210,000. These liabilities were not attached to Richard or Susan as primary guarantors. They were anchored to a third party. The parents were merely listed as authorized corporate administrators. The entire weight of the crushing debt was resting squarely on a completely separate Social Security number. I highlighted the masked Social Security number and initiated a deep trace identity verification. The algorithm processed the numeric sequence against federal registries. 5 seconds later, the name populated in stark black text: Ashley Moore. I stared at the screen. The air in my office seemed to suddenly evaporate. The twist landed with the devastating impact of a physical collision. I had spent 8 years assuming my parents viewed Ashley as a sacred entity, a pristine asset to be protected at all costs, while I was sacrificed to the wolves. The reality was vastly more cynical. They had not spared Ashley because she was delicate. They had simply exhausted my utility first. When I crossed the point of no return at 19, filing the felony police report and severing their access to my financial foundation, they lost their primary engine of survival. They did not restructure their failing business model. They did not downsize. They simply moved laterally down the bloodline. They targeted the next available resource. Ashley was currently sitting on $210,000 of hidden, toxic debt. The puzzle pieces from the past few months snapped together with horrifying clarity. The $60,000 plantation wedding was not an expression of parental generosity. It was a catastrophic financial illusion funded by predatory loans secured in her name. The incident at the premium bridal boutique in downtown Shreveport made perfect, sinister sense. Ashley handed her personal platinum card to the cashier, and the terminal rejected the transaction with a hard code error. Susan had rushed forward, peeling off $100 bills, claiming it was a weird, out-of-state security flag. It was not a bank error. Ashley's credit limits were entirely exhausted. Her debt-to-income ratio had ruptured because her parents were quietly draining her financial lifeblood to fund the facade of their own prosperity. Ashley was a financial ghost, and unlike me at 19, she was completely unaware of her own demise. She believed she possessed an unblemished record. She believed she was the golden child. She was entirely oblivious to the fact that she was financially bankrupt on paper, chained to a sinking commercial supply yard. "They used her to pay for her own wedding," I whispered, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "They took out loans in her name, threw her a massive party, and let her believe it was a gift." Wyatt stepped back from the chair. His analytical detachment fractured for a fraction of a second, revealing a profound disgust. "They did not come here to save the business," he said. "They came here because Ashley's credit is completely maxed out. They have no more host bodies left to drain. Delta Regional is their final play." I looked at the printed stack of data compiling on the network printer. I had the diagnostic report Richard demanded, but the scope of the conflict had shifted dramatically. This was no longer a simple exercise in self-defense. This was no longer about a $5,000 consultation fee or proving a point to the ghosts of my past. I was looking at a generational rot, a predatory cycle that consumed its own offspring to maintain a hollow illusion of status. I gathered the freshly printed pages. I separated the corporate tax liens and the delinquent vendor invoices into a primary stack. I slid them into a manila envelope. I took the pages detailing Ashley's $210,000 liability matrix and placed them in a secondary folder. I marked it with a red pen. I walked out of my private office, leaving Wyatt with the dual monitors. I returned to the glass-walled conference room. Richard and Susan sat in the exact same positions, waiting for the verdict. I dropped the primary manila envelope onto the mahogany table. "Your diagnostic report," I said, my voice echoing off the glass walls. "You have 3 active federal tax liens. You are facing litigation from 4 separate material vendors. Your personal credit utilization is at maximum capacity. You are financially toxic. Delta Regional will not approve a $1.2 million commercial loan under these conditions. No legitimate underwriter in the state of Louisiana will authorize that transfer of capital." Richard snatched the envelope, his hands trembling slightly as he pulled out the pages. His eyes darted across the data, realizing the catastrophic depth of his own exposure. He looked up at me, panic finally breaking through his arrogant exterior. "There has to be a structural workaround," he pleaded. "You know the banking algorithms. You know the loopholes. Tell us how to restructure the application to bypass the underwriting flags." I leaned over the table, placing my hands flat on the polished wood. "I am not your consultant anymore, Richard. I am your executioner." I did not mention Ashley. I did not reveal the secondary folder hidden behind my back. Exposing the golden child's ruin in this room would give them the opportunity to control the narrative, to spin a web of lies and gaslight her before she understood the magnitude of their betrayal. I needed to deliver the truth directly to the victim. I told them to leave the building. I informed them that security would escort them to their vehicle. They grabbed the envelope and practically fled the conference room, terrified by the cold, absolute finality in my voice. They believed they were leaving with the full scope of the diagnostic data. They were entirely unaware that I held the remaining puzzle pieces. I walked back to my office, holding the secondary folder containing the evidence of my sister's destruction. I sat down at my desk and pulled up my personal contacts. I had not spoken to Ashley in a decade. I had not seen her face outside of a digital photograph. But the dynamic had fundamentally altered. I was no longer the discarded backup plan. I was the sole possessor of a devastating truth. I dialed her cellular number, wondering how the golden child would react when she finally discovered the true cost of her pristine existence. I chose a restaurant in Baton Rouge for a specific reason. It was an upscale seafood establishment with white linen tablecloths, situated exactly halfway between my corporate fortress in New Orleans and the toxic gravity of Shreveport. It was neutral ground, a public space where raised voices and dramatic outbursts were suppressed by social convention. I arrived 20 minutes early. I requested a corner booth, ordered a glass of sparkling water, and placed a single manila folder on the table. Ashley was late. I watched her navigate the crowded dining room. She wore a tailored linen dress and a pair of diamond stud earrings. A new diamond wedding ring caught the ambient light. She moved with the distinct posture of a woman who had never been told no, expecting the world to naturally part and make way for her arrival. She reached the booth and slid into the leather seat opposite me. She did not offer a greeting. She did not reach out to hug the sister she had not seen in a decade. She placed her designer handbag on the empty chair beside her and signaled the waiter for a glass of Chardonnay. "If you invited me here to gloat about your magazine cover, save your breath," Ashley said. Her tone was sharp, layered with a preemptive hostility. "I am not interested in a lecture about your corporate achievements." I took a slow sip of my sparkling water. I studied her face. She was utilizing anger as a shield, anticipating a confrontation regarding her opulent wedding or the decade of silence. "I did not invite you here to discuss my business," I replied, keeping my voice low and measured. Ashley crossed her arms. Her posture radiated an unyielding arrogance. "Then why did you call? Mom and Dad told me you threw them out of your office yesterday. They drove all the way to New Orleans to ask for your professional guidance, and you humiliated them. They are struggling to keep the family legacy afloat. You could have helped them, Chloe. You have the resources." The defense of our parents was fascinating to witness. I decided to test the depth of her loyalty. "Like you helped me when I was 19. Ashley let out a short, dismissive sigh. The waiter arrived, placed her wine glass on the table, and retreated. She took a sip before answering. "We need to stop pretending you were a helpless victim," she said, leaning forward. "Dad told me about the custodial trust years ago. I knew what they did. I knew they leveraged your Social Security number to buy equipment for the yard. They needed the capital to keep the inventory moving." I sat perfectly still. The ambient noise of the restaurant clinking silverware, the low murmur of business lunches, faded into a dull static. "You knew," I stated. The word was not a question. It was an acknowledgement of a profound betrayal. "Of course I knew," Ashley said, a smug satisfaction creeping into her expression. "But what did you expect me to do? Call the authorities? Ruin my own standing in the family? The construction supply business is my inheritance. If they went under, my future went under. They promised they would pay it off eventually. You just panicked and filed a police report before they had the chance. You were always going to survive, Chloe. You always figure things out." I had to protect my own interests. The confession was a masterclass in entitlement. She was entirely complicit. She had observed my financial execution, watched me endure years of systemic isolation, and justified her silence because she believed she was preserving a kingdom she would one day inherit. She viewed my trauma as an acceptable operating cost for her pristine existence. Her arrogance provided the perfect canvas for the truth I was about to deliver. "I am glad you prioritize your financial interests," I said, shifting my tone from conversational to clinical. "Speaking of investments, I understand you and your new husband recently purchased a custom-built home in a gated community." Ashley narrowed her eyes, suspicious of the sudden pivot. "We did. We closed on the property 2 months ago. It is a beautiful estate." I rested my hands on the white linen tablecloth. "How was the underwriting process with the bank? Did you sign the mortgage documents alongside him, or did the loan officer mandate that the deed remain solely in his name?" The smugness evaporated from her features. Her hand froze halfway to her wineglass. A flicker of genuine uncertainty crossed her eyes. "My husband holds a higher income bracket," she said, her voice losing its sharp edge. "His individual credit profile secured a lower interest rate for the primary mortgage. It was a simple administrative decision. The real estate agent suggested it." I reached across the table and placed my index finger on the manila folder. I pushed it toward her. "It was not an administrative decision, Ashley. Your real estate agent ran a preliminary background check and discovered you are financially radioactive. Your husband had to exclude you from the mortgage application because your inclusion would have triggered an automatic denial from any legitimate lender in the state of Louisiana. Open the folder." Ashley stared at the manila envelope as if it contained a venomous snake. She reached out, her manicured fingers trembling slightly, and flipped open the cardboard cover. The top document was a certified copy of her comprehensive risk profile, generated by my proprietary software. "Look at the third page," I instructed, under the cross-collateralization section. She turned the pages. The silence stretching between us grew incredibly heavy. I watched her eyes track the lines of data. I watched her read the 5 masked account numbers, the commercial revolving credit lines, the heavy machinery leases, the unsecured personal loans masked as business injections. I watched her find the final balance listed at the bottom of the column, $210,000. Her breathing turned shallow and rapid. "This is a mistake," she whispered, the panic rising in her throat. "I do not own commercial delivery trucks. I do not buy raw lumber. These are the supply yard accounts. Dad pays these." "Richard and Susan are listed as authorized corporate administrators," I corrected. "You are the primary guarantor. They did not restructure their business when I severed their access 8 years ago. They simply moved down the bloodline. They targeted the next available Social Security number. You." A single tear spilled over her lower lash line, ruining her pristine makeup. She shook her head, clinging to the illusion of the golden child. "No, they would not do this to me. I am the heir to the business. They love me. They just threw me a massive wedding. I leaned forward, closing the physical distance between us. How do you think they funded that plantation venue, Ashley? How do you think they paid for the 10-piece brass band and the designer gown? They did not use cash from the business. The business is facing 3 federal tax liens. They funded your $60,000 celebration by drawing down the remaining limits on the credit cards secured in your name. They threw you a party using your own stolen identity, and they let you thank them for the privilege. Ashley pressed her hands to her mouth to stifle a sob. The psychological armor she had worn for a decade shattered into jagged pieces on the white linen. The realization struck her with unyielding force. She was not the cherished daughter. She was not the protected heir. She was the backup credit line. She was a host body, drained of her resources to maintain the hollow facade of our parents' wealth. Think about the bridal boutique, I continued, dismantling her final defense. Your personal platinum card declined with a hard code error. Susan rushed forward with a stack of cash and claimed it was an out-of-state security flag. It was not a bank error. Your debt-to-income ratio has ruptured. You are sitting on $250,000 in toxic, defaulted commercial liabilities. You are a ghost, Ashley. She could not formulate a response. The complicity she had displayed minutes earlier morphed into sheer, suffocating horror. She had profited from my destruction, only to discover she was the next victim in the sequence. She grabbed her designer handbag. She knocked over her glass of sparkling water, sending a puddle across the table. She did not apologize to the waiter, who rushed over with a towel. She stood up, her face pale and stricken, and walked blindly toward the exit of the restaurant. She left the manila folder sitting next to the spilled water. I remained in the corner booth. I asked the waiter for the check and paid the bill in full. I picked up the manila folder and walked out into the humid Baton Rouge afternoon. The confrontation was settled. The golden child was shattered, stripped of her illusions, and left to face the crushing reality of her own ruined foundation. My parents had officially exhausted their internal supply chain. They had no more daughters to drain. They had no more familial assets to leverage. The construction supply yard was hours away from federal seizure, and they had only one desperate option left on the board. They had to secure the $1.2 million commercial loan from Delta Regional Bank. They were about to walk into the largest financial institution in the region to submit a forged application. They were entirely unaware that the bank had just outsourced its high-risk compliance auditing to my corporate headquarters. The trap was set, and the ghosts of Shreveport were marching blindly toward the steel jaws. Logic dictates that when a terminal diagnosis is delivered, a rational patient begins to organize their affairs and prepare for the inevitable conclusion. Richard and Susan Moore did not operate on a foundation of logic. They operated on an intoxicating blend of arrogance and historical delusion. I had handed them the diagnostic report detailing their catastrophic financial decay. I had provided undeniable proof that their construction supply business was legally and operationally dead. A sane business owner would have filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection the following morning. Richard chose a different path. He decided to double down on the forgery. He ignored the data I provided in the glass-walled conference room. He assumed my software was flawed. Or perhaps he believed his capacity for manipulation could outmaneuver a digital algorithm. He and Susan spent the weekend fabricating new inventory logs, altering their quarterly profit projections, and drafting a fictional business plan that painted the failing gravel yard as a prime candidate for expansion. They proceeded with their application for the $1.2 million commercial loan. They submitted their forged documents to Delta Regional Bank in Shreveport. Delta Regional was an institution. It occupied a towering glass and steel building in the city center, projecting an image of impenetrable financial security. Richard viewed the bank as a familiar entity. He had golfed with several of the junior loan officers over the past 2 decades. He believed that personal connections, a firm handshake, and a confident smile could bypass stringent federal underwriting standards. He believed the old methods still applied. He was entirely oblivious to the monumental structural shift that had occurred behind the polished banking counters. The financial sector does not operate on handshakes anymore. It operates on data. 3 weeks prior to my parents submitting their application, Delta Regional Bank received a formal notification from federal regulators. The institution was scheduled for a comprehensive compliance audit by the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. The feds were targeting regional banks with a high concentration of commercial construction loans, searching for hidden liabilities and toxic assets before they triggered a regional economic collapse. To prepare for the federal scrutiny, the executive board of Delta Regional required an immediate, ruthless purge of their high-risk commercial portfolio. They lacked the internal processing power to complete the audit within the mandated timeline. They needed an elite, external software firm capable of scrubbing their entire system for cross-collateralization errors, custodial fraud, and hidden tax liens. Delta Regional outsourced their risk compliance underwriting to ClearPath Financial. The irony was absolute and profound. My parents had walked their fabricated tax returns and altered inventory logs through the grand double doors of their local bank, shook hands with a junior loan officer, and handed over the keys to their survival. They assumed the paperwork would sit on a desk in Shreveport. They did not know the junior officer simply scanned the documents into a secure corporate portal. They did not know that portal funneled the data 300 miles south, directly into the server racks I owned. I was sitting in my penthouse office in New Orleans on a Tuesday morning. The sky outside the panoramic windows was a brilliant, unclouded blue. My desk was clear, save for a single tablet displaying the live queue of our active compliance audits. Wyatt was scheduled to join me for a briefing regarding server capacity upgrades for the coming quarter. I took a sip of my dark roast coffee and tapped the screen to refresh the administrative dashboard. The software processed thousands of applications an hour, categorizing them into low, medium, and critical risk tiers. A high-priority notification materialized at the top of the interface. The algorithm had detected a severe anomaly in the Delta Regional feed. The system flagged a commercial loan application for immediate executive review due to a confluence of historic fraud markers and active federal tax liens. I tapped the alert to open the raw data file. The applicant name populated in bold block letters across the screen. Moore Commercial Construction Supply. Primary guarantor, Richard Moore. Secondary administrator, Susan Moore. Requested capital injection, $1,200,000. I set my coffee cup down. The ceramic clicked against the mahogany surface. I leaned closer to the monitor. I scrolled through the attached documentation. Richard had submitted a masterclass in financial fiction. He had inflated the value of his decaying lumber inventory by 300%. He had omitted the pending litigation from his primary material vendors entirely. He had presented a balance sheet that existed only in his imagination. The ClearPath algorithm possessed zero tolerance for fiction. The software immediately cross-referenced the names and addresses against the federal registries. It located the active tax liens Richard attempted to hide. It traced the historical data back 14 years, unearthing the pink carbon copy of the felony identity theft affidavit I had filed when I was 19. The system then executed a lateral search, identifying the $210,000 of toxic commercial debt they had quietly anchored to Ashley's Social Security number. The application was not just a weak request for funding, it was a documented, irrefutable act of federal wire fraud. My parents had marched directly into the fortress I designed, demanding the very capital they required to maintain their illusion, and handed me the definitive proof of their ongoing criminal enterprise. The trap they had spent decades building around their daughters had finally closed around their own necks. Wyatt walked into my office holding a stack of server blueprints. He noticed my posture. I was sitting perfectly rigid, staring at the tablet, with an expression he had learned to interpret. He set the blueprints on a side table and walked over to stand beside my chair. He looked at the screen. He read the applicant name. He read the requested loan amount. He read the blazing red error codes generated by the compliance algorithm. "They actually submitted it," he said, his voice a low mixture of disbelief and analytical satisfaction. "They forged the projections and filed the paperwork." I traced my finger across the digital signature block where Richard had signed his name, certifying under penalty of perjury that the attached information was accurate. "They are desperate," I replied. Desperation breeds a specific type of profound stupidity. They think the bank will just look at the logo on their letterhead and write the check. Wyatt pointed to the command interface at the bottom of the screen. Two distinct buttons glowed in the digital interface. Approve. Deny. The power dynamic had permanently inverted. The men and women who told me I was expendable, who banished me to a frozen bank account and a diet of rice and beans, were currently waiting by their phone in Shreveport for an answer. I held the digital key to their survival. With a single press of my index finger, I could terminate their application, freeze their remaining assets, and send an automated fraud alert to the federal banking authorities. I could execute their financial demise from the comfort of my leather chair, remaining a silent, invisible force in the shadows. It was the most efficient, sanitary method of concluding a decade of trauma. But a silent execution felt inadequate. Algorithms are efficient, but they lack poetry. My parents had spent their entire lives controlling the narrative. They lied to their community, they lied to their vendors, and they lied to their own daughters to preserve a facade of superiority. A digital denial code delivered via email would allow them to construct another lie. They would blame the banking system. They would blame a faceless bureaucracy. They would never be forced to acknowledge the architect of their ruin. "What is the protocol?" Wyatt asked, watching my hand hover over the tablet. I withdrew my hand. I did not touch the screen. I picked up my desktop phone and dialed the direct extension for the Senior Vice President of Commercial Lending at Delta Regional Bank. The line rang twice before he answered. "Ms. Moore," the Vice President said, his tone conveying the professional deference reserved for critical compliance auditors, "we appreciate your team accelerating the review of the high-risk queue." "I have a file on my desk that requires immediate escalation," I informed him, keeping my voice stripped of any personal inflection. "More commercial construction supply. The algorithmic scan indicates massive, multi-layered fraud, including active federal tax evasion and historic identity theft. The applicant submitted forged documentation across multiple vectors." I heard the sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. The Vice President understood the severity of the situation. A fraudulent loan of that magnitude, discovered during an active FDIC audit, could result in federal fines capable of shutting down the entire branch. "I will terminate the application immediately in the system," he stated, the panic evident in his sudden shift in cadence. "I will contact the client and issue a standard denial letter." "Do not issue the denial," I commanded. "Do not terminate the application in the automated system." The Vice President paused, confused by the deviation from standard protocol. "I do not understand. The compliance parameters dictate immediate rejection for documented fraud." "This file requires an executive intervention," I explained, leaning back in my chair. "I am the proxy auditor assigned to protect your institution from federal penalties. A digital denial is insufficient. I am placing an administrative hold on the Moore file. Schedule an in-person meeting with the applicants for this Friday morning at your primary branch in Shreveport. Tell them their application requires a final executive sign-off." "You want to conduct the compliance review in person?" he asked, clearly uncomfortable with the sudden escalation. I require absolute certainty that the applicants understand the specific nature of their rejection, I said. I will deliver the final risk assessment myself. The vice president agreed, recognizing my authority to dictate the terms of the audit. I ended the call. Wyatt looked at me. A slow, precise understanding settled into his expression. You are not going to hit the button. I stood up from my desk. I walked over to the bottom drawer and unlocked it. I pulled out the black binder. It was heavy, packed with 14 years of receipts, legal threats, and printed evidence. I set it on the mahogany desk. No, I am not going to hit the button, I said, tracing the brass corners of my own ledger. I am going to drive to Shreveport. The silent phase of the conflict was officially over. I possessed the undeniable proof of their crimes, and I was going to present the mathematics of their destruction in the glaring light of a corporate boardroom. The ghosts were expecting $1 million lifeline. They were about to discover the executioner was already sitting at the table. The drive north to Shreveport felt entirely different this time. At 19, I had gripped the steering wheel of a decaying sedan with white knuckles, vibrating with the desperate anger of a child demanding an explanation. At 24, I reclined in the passenger seat of an armored luxury SUV, watching the Louisiana landscape blur past the tinted windows. Wyatt drove. He maintained a steady speed, his focus fixed on the interstate. The black binder rested on the leather seat between us, accompanied by a sealed manila envelope bearing the official corporate seal of ClearPath Financial. We had utilized the 72 hours preceding the meeting to construct an impenetrable legal and financial blockade. I instructed my senior compliance team to execute a deep forensic trace on the $210,000 of toxic commercial debt anchored to Ashley's Social Security number. We required undeniable proof linking the funds directly to the construction supply yard operations. The analysts delivered exactly that. They mapped the wire transfers from the fraudulent loans straight into Richard's primary operating accounts, proving he was the sole beneficiary of the stolen capital. We were not just driving to a bank meeting. We were delivering an execution warrant. We arrived at the Delta Regional Headquarters 15 minutes prior to the scheduled appointment. The building was a testament to old money and institutional power. Granite columns, polished brass fixtures, and security guards stationed in the grand lobby. We checked in at the reception desk under the pretense of the FDIC proxy audit. We were directed to the executive suite on the top floor. The senior vice president of commercial lending met us at the elevator bay. His name was Harrison Vance. He possessed the rigid posture and anxious energy of an executive whose career was currently resting in the hands of an external auditor. He extended his hand, thanking me profusely for personally handling the Moore file. I understand the applicants have arrived, I said, returning his handshake with a firm, brief grip. Vance nodded, his expression grim. They are waiting in boardroom C. They brought their eldest daughter with them. She is listed as a secondary cosigner on the revised paperwork they submitted yesterday. They seem highly confident, Ms. Moore. They indicated this was a formality. The inclusion of Ashley introduced a brutal new variable into the equation. They had dragged the golden child into the bank, intending to leverage her pristine corporate reputation as a public relations manager to bolster their fraudulent application. They were entirely unaware that Ashley now possessed the manila folder containing the reality of her own financial ruin. They did not know she had fled a Baton Rouge restaurant in terror just weeks prior. They were bringing a hostage to a negotiation, oblivious to the fact that the hostage was fully aware of her captivity. Vance gestured toward the heavy mahogany double doors at the end of the corridor. "Do you require me to introduce you?" he asked, clearly eager to delegate the unpleasant nature of the rejection. "You will remain in the room, Mr. Vance," I instructed, adopting the authoritative tone of a senior compliance officer. "Your presence is required to officially record the audit findings, but I will manage the presentation." Wyatt picked up the black binder and the manila envelope. We walked down the carpeted hallway. The air was cool and silent, insulated from the chaos of the city below. I did not feel a spike of adrenaline. I felt the cold, absolute certainty of an equation balancing perfectly at zero. Vance pushed open the heavy wooden doors. Boardroom C was an imposing space. A massive oval table dominated the room, surrounded by ergonomic leather chairs. The walls were paneled in rich cherry wood. Richard and Susan Moore sat on the far side of the table. They wore their Sunday best, Richard in a tailored suit projecting the image of a successful patriarch, Susan in a conservative navy dress, her posture erect, her designer handbag resting near her elbow. They looked like a couple preparing to sign the paperwork for a lucrative expansion. Ashley sat near the corner of the table, physically distanced from her parents. She looked hollow. The vibrant, arrogant woman I met in Baton Rouge had vanished. Her skin was pale, her eyes rimmed with exhaustion. She wore a simple gray blouse and slacks, lacking any designer accessories. She stared at the polished surface of the table, avoiding eye contact with anyone in the room. The heavy doors closed behind us with a solid, definitive click. Richard looked up, preparing his standard, charismatic greeting for the banking executives. His smile formed halfway, a practiced reflex of corporate charm. Then he saw my face. The smile died instantly. His facial muscles went slack. The blood drained from his cheeks, replaced by an ashen, sickly hue. He blinked rapidly, his mind struggling to process the impossible visual information. He looked at my tailored suit, at the authoritative stance I maintained, and then at Wyatt, holding the documentation. Susan reacted a fraction of a second later. Her mouth opened slightly, a silent gasp escaping her lips. She gripped the strap of her designer handbag, her knuckles turning stark white. "What is she doing here?" Richard demanded, his voice a harsh, sudden rasp in the quiet boardroom. He turned to Vance, anger masking his rising panic. "We requested a meeting with the Commercial Lending Committee to finalize our funding. We did not request a family reunion. Remove her from this room." Vance did not flinch. He walked to the side of the table and stood perfectly still, assuming his role as a witness. "Ms. Moore is not here in a familial capacity, Mr. Moore," Vance stated, his tone devoid of any accommodation. "ClearPath Financial handles the federal risk auditing for this institution. Ms. Moore is our proxy FDIC compliance officer. She is here to present the final determination on your commercial loan application." The words landed like physical strikes. Richard sank back into his leather chair, the fight draining out of his posture. He understood the architecture of the trap immediately. He realized he had marched his forged documents directly into the server racks I owned. The arrogant patriarch who laughed at my police report when I was 19 was now trapped in a sealed room, facing an auditor with an encyclopedic memory of his crimes. Ashley finally looked up from the table. Her eyes met mine. The expression she wore was a complex mixture of abject terror and resigned validation. She knew exactly what was contained in the folders Wyatt carried. She knew the execution was imminent. I walked to the head of the oval table. I did not sit down. I preferred to remain standing, establishing an undeniable physical dominance over the proceedings. Wyatt placed the black binder on the polished wood. He set the sealed manila envelope next to it. He stepped back, standing behind my right shoulder, a silent, immovable guard. "Your application for a $1.2 million commercial capital injection triggered a severe, multi-layered security protocol within our underwriting algorithm," I began, my voice cold, factual, and projecting across the long table. "You submitted financial projections that inflate your inventory valuation by 300%. You omitted 4 active, hostile litigation filings from primary material vendors. You concealed 3 severe federal tax liens currently levied against your physical property. Susan tried to interrupt, reverting to her default tactic of feigning ignorance. "There must be a clerical error in your system," she stammered, her voice shaking. "We have always maintained excellent standing with our suppliers. Our accountant prepared those projections." I did not acknowledge her interruption. I picked up the manila envelope, broke the corporate seal, and extracted the comprehensive diagnostic report. "I am not finished detailing the fraud markers," I continued, my gaze fixed directly on Richard. "The algorithm also initiated a cross-collateralization trace. We located a historical anomaly attached to the primary applicant. 14 years ago, you established a custodial business trust to secure heavy machinery leases and revolving corporate credit. You utilized the Social Security number of a minor dependent without legal authorization." Richard opened his mouth to argue, perhaps preparing to claim it was a family investment, to recycle the tired manipulation he used in the hardware yard. I did not allow him the opportunity. I opened the black binder. I pulled the pink carbon copy of the felony identity theft affidavit from its plastic sleeve and slid it down the length of the mahogany table. It stopped directly in front of him. "The debt was formally contested via a police report filed 5 years ago," I stated. "The authorities maintain an open, dormant file regarding the commercial bank fraud. That incident alone disqualifies your corporate entity from securing capital from any federally insured institution." Richard stared at the pink slip of paper. His chest heaved with shallow breaths. He was a man watching the walls of his kingdom crumble in real time, lacking any structural support to hold them up. But a simple denial was not the culmination of my strategy. A denial merely sent them back to the gravel yard to wait for foreclosure. They had brought Ashley into this room, attempting to use her as a final piece of collateral. It was time to introduce the ultimate variable into the equation. I turned my attention to my sister, and the silence in the boardroom stretched until it felt capable of snapping bone. The silence in the boardroom was absolute. It was the kind of heavy, pressurized quiet that precedes a catastrophic structural failure. Richard sat frozen, staring at the pink carbon copy of the police report I had just weaponized against him. Susan clutched her handbag, her eyes darting between my face and the bank executive standing near the door. They thought the ambush was complete. They believed the presentation of their historical fraud was the final blow. They were wrong. The true detonation had not yet occurred. I turned my attention from the failing patriarch to the woman sitting in the corner seat. Ashley looked entirely broken. The tailored lines of her gray blouse seemed to hang loosely on her frame. The arrogance she had worn like armor for a decade had completely eroded. She was not a cosigner, arriving to guarantee a lucrative expansion. She was a hostage, waiting for her executioners to be unmasked. I picked up the secondary folder from the table. It was standard manila, unmarked, save for a single red slash across the top right corner. I held it in my hand, feeling the weight of the data inside. Furthermore, I continued, my voice steady, devoid of any familial warmth, the compliance algorithm requires a comprehensive review of all secondary guarantors listed on the application. The system executed a deep diagnostic trace on the Social Security number provided for Ashley Moore. Richard's head snapped up. His eyes widened, the panic escalating into sheer, unadulterated terror. He raised his hand, a weak, trembling gesture, as if he could physically halt the words before they left my mouth. "Chloe, please," he rasped. "We can withdraw the application. We will leave right now." I ignored him. I did not look at him. My gaze remained fixed on Ashley. The diagnostic trace revealed a massive, deliberate, cross-collateralization structure, I stated, ensuring Vance heard every syllable clearly. The primary applicants utilized the secondary guarantor's identity to mask their own insolvency. Currently, there are 5 heavily defaulted commercial accounts anchored to Ashley Moore. The total active liability exceeds $210,000. Susan let out a sharp, choked sound. She pressed a hand to her mouth, her eyes wide with shock. Not because of the crime. She knew about the crime. She was shocked that the secret had breached the perimeter of their carefully constructed reality and entered a federal auditing environment. I slid the manila folder down the polished wood. It stopped directly in front of Ashley. She did not reach for it. She simply stared at the cardboard cover, her breathing shallow and ragged. The funds drawn from those 5 accounts were directly wired into the primary operating accounts of Moore Construction Supply, I explained, looking at Vance. My analysts verified the transfer sequences yesterday. This is not a clerical error or a misunderstanding regarding a family trust. This is active, ongoing wire fraud. They systematically drained their eldest daughter's credit profile to maintain a facade of corporate solvency. Ashley finally spoke. Her voice was weak, lacking any of the confident projection she used in her public relations career. "You knew," she whispered, looking directly at Richard. Richard swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. He tried to summon his customary authority, the commanding presence that usually silenced dissent. "Ashley, honey, you do not understand corporate finance," he said, his voice trembling despite his efforts. "It was a bridge strategy. We needed liquidity. The housing market contracted. We were going to consolidate the debt when this loan cleared. We were protecting your inheritance." Ashley stood up. The movement was sharp and sudden. Her chair scraped loudly against the thick carpet. "Protecting my inheritance," she repeated, her voice rising in pitch, thick with betrayal and rising hysteria. "You bought my wedding dress with stolen money. You paid for a brass band with fraudulent loans secured under my name. My husband had to sign our mortgage alone because the bank told him I was financially radioactive. You did not protect my inheritance. You used me as a human shield because Chloe locked you out." Susan reached out, attempting to grasp Ashley's hand. "Please, sweetie, calm down. We can fix this. Your father has a plan." Ashley recoiled, jerking her hand away as if Susan's touch was toxic. "Do not touch me. Do not ever touch me again." She turned and practically ran toward the heavy double doors. She did not look back. She did not acknowledge me or Wyatt. She slammed her hand against the brass handle, threw the door open, and disappeared down the executive corridor. The heavy wood swung shut, plunging the boardroom back into a crushing silence. I turned back to Richard. He looked utterly defeated. The patriarch of the Moore family had been stripped of his illusions, his assets, and his favored child. He was a hollow shell sitting in a rented suit. I looked at Harrison Vance. The bank executive's face was a mask of professional horror. He had just witnessed the live dissection of a massive criminal enterprise occurring within his own institution. "Mr. Vance," I said, bringing the focus back to the official capacity of the meeting. "Based on the documented historical fraud, the forged financial projections submitted this week, and the active wire fraud currently destroying a secondary victim, ClearPath Financial issues its final determination." I picked up my pen. I did not require the black binder anymore. The evidence was irrefutable. This application is denied with extreme prejudice. Vance nodded sharply, eager to formalize the rejection and distance his institution from the radioactive applicants. "The denial is noted and officially logged, Ms. Moore. Delta Regional Bank will comply with all federal reporting mandates regarding the fraudulent documentation submitted today." Richard slumped forward, resting his forehead against his hands. The reality of his situation finally breached his arrogance. A denial with extreme prejudice meant his business was dead. The federal reporting mandates meant the authorities would be knocking on his door before the end of the week. The IRS would seize the gravel yard. The vendors would sue him into personal bankruptcy. He was going to lose the hardware store, the house, the trucks, and the legacy he had sacrificed his own daughters to preserve. "Chloe," he whispered, his voice muffled by his hands. He raised his head, his eyes red-rimmed and pleading. He did not call me the backup plan. He did not tap a brass ledger and laugh. He looked at me with the desperate, raw panic of a drowning man begging for a life raft. "I know I failed you," he rasped. "I know I made terrible decisions. But they are going to take everything. They will seize the house. Susan will have nowhere to go. I could face federal charges for the wire transfers." He paused, swallowing hard. The arrogance was completely eradicated. "Please, Chloe, you have the software firm. You have the wealth. I am not asking for $1 million anymore. Just a personal loan. $50,000. Just enough to hire a defense attorney and secure a small apartment for your mother. I will sign whatever contract you want. I will pay you back with interest. Please, you are the only family we have left." I stared at the man who had forged my signature when I was a teenager, the man who had banished me to a frozen bank account and a diet of rice and beans, the man who told the extended family I was too busy acting superior to attend a wedding he funded with stolen capital. He was asking me to finance his legal defense for the very crimes he committed against me and my sister. I reached into the inner pocket of my tailored navy blazer. My fingers brushed against a small, folded piece of paper I had placed there that morning. I did not pull out a checkbook. I did not pull out a corporate contract. I withdrew my hand and placed a single item on the polished mahogany table. I used my index finger to slide it slowly across the wood, stopping it directly in front of him. The item rested next to the pink carbon copy of the police report. It was crisp and slightly worn at the edges. It was a $5 bill. When I was 19 years old, driving a 10-year-old sedan with a cracked windshield, my father had handed me a $5 bill and told me to buy enough gas to drive back to Baton Rouge and let the adults handle the business. It was the exact amount he deemed my survival was worth. "That is your capital injection, Richard," I said, my voice echoing with absolute, cold finality. "Let the adults handle the business." I picked up the black binder. I did not look at him again. I turned and walked toward the double doors, leaving the architect of my trauma sitting in the ruins of his own kingdom. The execution was complete. The ghosts were finally buried. The heavy oak door clicked shut, sealing the executive boardroom. The echo of Ashley fleeing down the corridor faded into the thick carpet, leaving a vacuum of sound in her wake. The golden child was gone, taking with her the final illusion of the Moore family legacy. Richard stared at the closed door for several seconds. The shock of his eldest daughter turning her back on him triggered a profound chemical shift in his system. The panic that had gripped him moments earlier mutated. It calcified into a rigid, defensive hostility. The patriarch could not sustain the posture of a defeated man. His ego demanded a countermeasure. He stood up. The leather chair rolled backward, bumping into the cherry wood paneled wall. His face flushed a dark, mottled crimson. He planted both hands on the polished mahogany table and leaned forward, directing his gaze at me. "You orchestrated this entire spectacle," he hissed, his voice vibrating with venom. "You manipulated the compliance algorithm. You brought us into this room just to stage a theatrical stunt. You are a vindictive, ungrateful child settling a teenage grudge." Susan nodded in rapid agreement, emboldened by her husband taking the offensive. "She is trying to ruin us because she is jealous," Susan told the bank executive. "She has always been jealous of her sister." Harrison Vance stood near the wall, his expression shifting from professional discomfort to severe alarm. He was witnessing a total psychological unraveling. I did not raise my voice. I did not match his erratic energy. I maintained the flat, precise cadence of an underwriter delivering a terminal diagnosis. "I do not write the data, Richard. I merely illuminate it." I opened the official ClearPath compliance dossier resting on the table. I turned to the final signature page. I retrieved my titanium pen from my inner jacket pocket. "Your application for the $1.2 million commercial loan is denied with prejudice," I stated. Richard scoffed, a harsh, grating sound. He pointed a trembling finger at my face. You think you hold all the cards because you built a software program. You think a few rejected credit checks and a misunderstanding over a family trust will put me in the ground. The supply yard has tangible assets. We have inventory. We have a 30-year operating history in this state. I will walk across the street to a competitor, and I will secure the funding by the end of the day. I set the pen down. He was clinging to the delusion that his accounting fiction could withstand external scrutiny. He believed his shadow economy was secure. It was time to demolish the foundation. You do not have a 30-year operating history, I corrected him. You have a 30-year history of organized wire fraud. I reached into the manila envelope. I bypassed the standard credit reports and the tax liens. I withdrew a thick stack of printed spreadsheets. The pages were covered in dense numerical grids formatted with a distinct archaic accounting software. I slid the stack across the mahogany table. The papers fanned out, revealing columns of illicit cash transfers, altered vendor invoices, and off-the-books inventory liquidations. Richard looked down. The crimson flush drained from his face, leaving behind a sickly, translucent pallor. His knees buckled slightly, forcing him to grip the edge of the table to remain standing. When you attempted to sue me for defamation last year, my legal team issued a comprehensive discovery demand, I explained, watching his eyes dart across the damning numbers. You withdrew the lawsuit to prevent us from executing a subpoena on your physical assets. You thought canceling the litigation closed the perimeter. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the table. But you forgot that your suppliers utilize digital invoicing. You forgot that your secondary lenders report to federal clearinghouses. My algorithm did not just scan your current application. It worked backward. It cross-referenced every discrepancy, every missing lumber shipment, and every phantom cash deposit over the past 2 decades. The software reconstructed your shadow economy. I tapped the top page of the spreadsheet. I digitized the brass ledger, Richard. Susan let out a breathless whimper. She recognized the term. She knew the dark green book with the heavy corners contained the true criminal architecture of their existence. She knew the ledger proved their insolvency was not a recent consequence of market shifts, but a premeditated, multi-decade scheme to defraud federal institutions. Harrison Vance stepped forward. The bank vice president could no longer remain a passive witness. The introduction of reconstructed ledger data elevated the situation from a rejected application to an active federal crime occurring within his branch. He picked up the top 3 pages of the spreadsheet. He scanned the columns, verifying the routing numbers and the concealed cash transfers. His jaw set into a hard, unforgiving line. Mr. Moore, Vance said, his voice dropping an octave, carrying the full, crushing weight of the banking establishment. Delta Regional is a federally insured institution. Submitting fabricated financial projections is a federal offense. Attempting to secure capital using a secondary guarantor whose identity you compromised is wire fraud. Richard opened his mouth, but no sound emerged. His vocal cords seemed paralyzed. Vance did not wait for a response. He walked toward the boardroom telephone console. I am terminating this meeting immediately, Vance announced. Furthermore, under the fraud mitigation clauses embedded in your existing commercial accounts, Delta Regional is exercising its right of offset. I am placing an immediate administrative freeze on every checking, savings, and payroll account associated with Moore Construction Supply. The bank will seize your active liquid deposits to cover the immediate federal fraud penalties generated by this application. The words struck the patriarch like physical projectiles. A freeze on the payroll accounts meant the supply yard ceased to exist today. It meant the gates would lock. It meant the remaining employees would not receive their wages. It meant the inventory would sit and rot until the federal marshals arrived to catalog the wreckage. Susan began to weep. The sound was not theatrical. It was a guttural, desperate noise. She collapsed into her leather chair, burying her face in her hands. Richard slowly lowered himself back into his seat. The transition from arrogant businessman to condemned criminal was complete. The illusion was eradicated. He looked at the digitized brass ledger, then at the bank executive holding the phone, and finally, he looked at me. The realization of his impending reality settled over his features. The federal investigators would seize the yard, they would auction the house, they would scrutinize the tax evasion. He was looking at a mandatory minimum sentence in a federal penitentiary. He possessed zero liquidity, zero credit, and zero allies. "Chloe," he whispered. The hostility was gone, replaced by a pathetic, hollow pleading. He leaned across the table, reaching a shaking hand toward me. "They are taking the accounts," he rasped, tears pooling in the deep lines around his eyes. "We have nothing left. We will lose the house by the end of the month. I will go to prison. Susan will be on the street." He swallowed hard, stripping away the last remaining shred of his pride. "Please, you have the venture capital. You have the software empire. I am begging you. Just a personal loan. $50,000. Just enough to retain a criminal defense attorney to keep me out of a cell. I will sign anything. I will work for you. Please. You cannot let your own father die in a federal prison." I stared at the man begging for salvation. I remembered sitting in a sweltering Shreveport police precinct at 19 years old, signing an affidavit while my bank accounts were frozen. I remembered the diet of rice and beans. I remembered the 4-minute voicemail telling me I was dead to the family. I did not reach for my corporate checkbook. I did not signal Wyatt to draft a promissory note. I reached into the inner pocket of my tailored blazer. My fingers located the item I had placed there early that morning, anticipating the exact mathematics of this conclusion. I withdrew my hand and placed a small, rectangular piece of paper onto the mahogany table. It was crisp, green, and slightly worn at the edges. I pressed my index finger against the paper and slid it slowly across the polished wood. It glided over the digitized brass ledger. It passed the pink carbon copy of the police report. It stopped precisely an inch from his trembling hand. It was a $5 bill. Richard stared at the currency. His brow furrowed in desperate confusion. He looked at me, uncomprehending. "When I was 19 years old," I said, my voice cutting through the silent room like a scalpel, "you told me to leave this city. You told me you would not pay a single cent of the $142,000 you stole. I told you I had no money to drive back to Baton Rouge." I pointed to the green paper resting on the table. "You reached into your wallet. You handed me a $5 bill. You told me to buy enough gasoline to cross the parish line, and then you told me to let the adults handle the business." Richard looked at the bill. The memory materialized in his eyes, bringing with it the crushing weight of poetic justice. He realized the currency was not an insult. It was a mirror, reflecting his own exact measure of mercy. I picked up the ClearPath FDIC dossier. I did not break eye contact. "That is your defense fund, Richard. Let the adults handle the business." I turned my back on the table. Wyatt opened the heavy mahogany doors. We walked out into the corridor, leaving the architect of my trauma sitting in the ruins of his empire, staring at a $5 bill. Time is a ruthless and highly efficient auditor. 6 months after the heavy oak doors of the Delta Regional Bank boardroom closed, the federal government executed its mandates with glacial, crushing precision. The United States Marshals Service arrived at the Shreveport construction supply yard on a Tuesday morning. They dismissed the remaining staff, locked the administrative offices, and placed heavy steel padlocks on the perimeter chain-link gates. The physical assets of the Moore legacy were cataloged, tagged, and sold at public auction to satisfy a fraction of the outstanding federal tax liens. The yellow forklifts, the delivery trucks, and the treated lumber were towed away, leaving behind an empty, silent gravel lot. Without the corporate structure to absorb their fabricated lifestyle, the personal finances of Richard and Susan Moore imploded. They filed Chapter 7 bankruptcy in federal court. The court-appointed trustee liquidated their residential estate, forcing them out of their sprawling 4-bedroom home and into a cramped ground-floor apartment on the outskirts of the city. Richard avoided a sentence in a federal penitentiary through a binding plea agreement with the district attorney. He surrendered every remaining liquid asset, forfeited his pension, and accepted a lifetime ban from holding any corporate administrative position. The arrogant patriarch who once tapped a brass ledger and mocked my survival was reduced to a reliant, silent pensioner, trapped in a prison constructed entirely of his own poor calculations. Ashley faced a different geometry of consequence. The fallout from the bank ambush shattered the stained glass window of her reality. She recognized the predators standing in her own living room. Her response was swift and absolute. She initiated a formal legal separation from Richard and Susan, blocking their phone numbers and securing a restraining order when Susan attempted to arrive unannounced at her public relations firm. 2 months after the confrontation, Ashley sent an email to my corporate address. The message was brief. It contained no emotional manipulation or demands for sibling solidarity. She asked for an underwriting consultation. I agreed to meet her via a secure video conference. We established a rigid, unsentimental boundary. I did not offer her a loan to bypass the $210,000 liability. Erasing her debt with my capital would merely replace one toxic dependency with another. Instead, I provided her with the raw software scripts Wyatt and I wrote during our years of systemic isolation. I outlined a brutal 60-month credit rehabilitation program. She had to sell her luxury vehicle. She had to negotiate harsh settlements with the commercial vendors. She had to navigate the bureaucratic maze of identity theft mitigation with her new husband scrutinizing every transaction. The golden child illusion was dismantled, replaced by the unforgiving labor of accountability. We do not exchange holiday greeting cards. We do not share Sunday dinners. But we share a mutual respect, born from surviving the same wreckage, standing on opposite sides of a very clear line. The resolution of their downfall did not generate a parade or a euphoric celebration in New Orleans. True closure is quiet. It arrives without fanfare. It is the sudden realization that your shoulders are no longer braced for an incoming impact. I was sitting in the study of our Garden District home on a Friday evening. The air conditioning hummed a steady, reliable rhythm. The mahogany desk felt solid beneath my hands. The black binder rested in the center of the leather blotter. I traced my fingers over the heavy metal rings. I opened the cover and turned the pages. The pink carbon copy from the police precinct. The printed transcription of the voicemail disowning me. The photographs of the empty graduation chairs. The itemized cost of the plantation wedding. The digital reconstruction of the brass ledger. A decade of evidence meticulously cataloged, dated, and secured in clear plastic sleeves. I looked at the documents and realized I did not possess any new items to file. The threat was neutralized. The accounting was settled. The predators were stripped of their teeth. I closed the cover. The familiar click of the metal rings echoed in the silent room. I opened the bottom drawer of the desk, placed the heavy ledger inside, and turned the brass key. I dropped the key into a small ceramic bowl on the bookshelf. The vault was officially sealed. I would never need to open it again. I walked out the back doors onto the covered veranda. The intense Louisiana heat had broken, leaving behind a warm, fragrant twilight. The scent of night-blooming jasmine and damp soil hung in the humid air. A ceiling fan circulated a gentle breeze overhead. The distant, rhythmic clatter of a streetcar rolling down St. Charles Avenue provided a comforting metropolitan heartbeat. Wyatt sat on a woven wicker sofa, holding a tablet, reviewing a benign line of code for an upcoming software patch. He wore a simple gray hooded sweatshirt, looking exactly like the quiet, analytical programmer I met in the university library so many years ago. He looked up when I walked outside. He did not ask about the binder. He did not ask if I felt a sense of vindication or sorrow. He recognized the shift in my posture. He saw that the invisible armor I had worn since I was 19 years old had finally been removed. He set the tablet on the glass coffee table and shifted his weight, creating a space beside him on the cushions. I sat down. The physical environment was a profound contrast to the freezing, isolated server rooms where we first engineered our survival. We had constructed a digital fortress, and it had protected the physical life we built within its walls. Wyatt reached over and rested his hand over mine. His grip was steady, requiring no translation. He was the partner who stood quietly in the shadows while the battles were fought, providing the structural integrity I needed to swing the final gavel. The journey from a devastated 19-year-old girl holding a 12-page credit report to a chief executive officer holding the fate of a commercial bank taught me a distinct lesson regarding human architecture. Society conditions us to believe that blood dictates loyalty. We are told to absorb the transgressions of our relatives because proximity requires endless forgiveness. We are instructed to excuse the theft, the gaslighting, and the betrayals under the guise of maintaining a family legacy. The mathematics of reality tell a vastly different story. Family is not determined by a shared last name or a biological lineage. Family consists of the individuals who respect your perimeter. It is the people who do not view your success as a resource to be mined or your resilience as an excuse to inflict harm. Love is not a line item on a balance sheet. It is not an invoice you have to finance with your sanity or your Social Security number. It is the quiet hum of a safe life, shared with those who earn the right to stand beside you when the storm finally breaks. They expected a frightened 19-year-old girl. They got an auditor with a decade of receipts. If this story reminds you that your peace is worth protecting, share it. Hit subscribe, and I will see you in the next one. We are conditioned from a very early age to view the traditional American family as a sanctuary. We are taught that the generational businesses, the manicured suburban lawns, and the carefully curated holiday photographs are monuments to hard work and unconditional love. We believe that parents are the ultimate architects of our safety, laying the foundation upon which we will eventually build our own lives. But Chloe Moore's narrative forces us to confront a terrifying, unspoken question. What happens when the architects decide to dismantle the foundation to salvage the roof? Chloe's journey from a discarded 19-year-old student to a formidable corporate auditor is far more than a forensic thriller about credit restoration. It is a profound, cautionary mirror held up to the darkest corners of parental responsibility and the toxic pursuit of the American dream. When the preservation of a public image supersedes the psychological and financial safety of a child, the family unit ceases to be a sanctuary. It becomes a predatory enterprise. At the core of this tragedy is the devastating implementation of the golden child and the scapegoat dynamic. Richard and Susan Moore did not simply fail as business owners. They failed fundamentally as parents the moment they assigned transactional values to their daughters. In American culture, we frequently celebrate the independent, self-sufficient child. We applaud the ones who require minimal supervision, the ones who quietly shoulder their own burdens. But emotional awareness requires a parent to recognize that a child's resilience is not an invitation for exploitation. Richard labeled Chloe the backup plan because she could figure things out. And he categorized Ashley as delicate, requiring a pristine environment to thrive. This bifurcation destroyed them both. Fairness in parenting does not mean purchasing identical luxury vehicles or funding identical weddings. Fairness means providing every child with the identical baseline of truth, emotional safety, and uncompromised potential. By treating Ashley as a fragile asset to be protected, they blinded her to reality. ultimately using her as a human shield and burying her under $250,000 of toxic debt disguised as parental generosity. By treating Chloe as an expendable utility, they initiated a fracture that could never be repaired. They believed they were navigating a financial crisis, but they were actually engaged in the systematic destruction of their own lineage. A family business is frequently hailed as the ultimate hallmark of domestic achievement. We romanticize the idea of passing the torch to the next generation. Yet, Richard's brass ledger, the hidden book where he documented his financial fictions, became a symbol of profound moral decay. Long-term guidance for children requires the courage to fail honestly rather than succeed deceptively. True parental responsibility means that if the ship is sinking, you do not anchor your offspring to the hull just to buy yourself another month of breathing room. You sit at the kitchen table, you look your children in the eye, and you tell them the uncomfortable truth. You teach them how to navigate a storm through transparency, not by forging their signatures in the dark. The most insidious weapon utilized in this narrative was not the stolen Social Security number. It was the weaponized silence. When Chloe drew a boundary, her parents retaliated by erasing her from the family geometry. They left 3 empty chairs at her college graduation. They excluded her from her sister's opulent wedding. In a healthy family structure, parents are the steady, unyielding ground beneath a child's feet. Discipline and guidance are meant to correct, not to annihilate. When parents use their presence as a conditional currency, withdrawing their love the moment a child ceases to be useful, they teach that child that affection is merely a line item on a ledger, subject to immediate cancellation. This is the hidden crisis occurring behind the closed doors of seemingly perfect neighborhoods. We see the custom-built homes, the luxury vehicles, and the smiling portraits, but we rarely see the black binders being filled with the receipts of emotional and financial betrayal. We rarely discuss the children who are quietly paying the debts of their parents' egos, working graveyard shifts in freezing data centers while their families toast to their own success. It is for exactly this reason that we must continue to shine a light into these shadowed corridors. We must dismantle the stigma of the estranged child and recognize that sometimes walking away is the only method of survival. If Chloe's path resonates with the quiet, grueling battles you are fighting in your own life, if you have ever had to build a fortress to protect yourself from the people who were supposed to be your sanctuary, I invite you to join our community. Follow the channel Elena Vengeance. We are dedicated to exploring the profound, often painful realities of family dynamics, the vital necessity of boundary setting, and the quiet courage it takes to rewrite your own legacy. Subscribe, share your story in the comments, and find the validation that you are never walking this difficult road alone. As we reflect on the ruins of the Moore family supply yard, we are left with a lingering, uncomfortable realization about the nature of inheritance. We spend decades accumulating wealth, expanding businesses, and polishing our reputations, believing these are the greatest gifts we can leave behind for our children. We draft wills and establish trusts, obsessed with what we will pass down when we are gone. But a legacy is not measured by the capital transferred upon our passing. It is measured by the psychological architecture we build within our children while we are still here. It is measured by our capacity to tell the truth when the truth is devastating, and our willingness to absorb our own failures rather than placing them on the shoulders of the next generation. Perhaps the ultimate inheritance is not the money we leave for our children, but the future we refuse to steal from them. Look closely at the people sitting around your own dining table. Consider the expectations you place upon them and the secrets you keep hidden in the dark. If the foundation of your home were suddenly subjected to a forensic audit, exposed to the glaring light of truth, what kind of ledger would it reveal? Would it show a history of unwavering support and transparent love? Or would it reveal a quiet accumulation of debts that someone else will eventually have to pay? The numbers always balance in the end. The only question that remains is who will be holding the pen when the final calculation is made.